She stood in the middle of 500 people, her cheek burning, her ears ringing from the impact of her husband's hand, and she did not cry. She did not scream. She did not beg. Naomi Carter smoothed the front of her gown, lifted her chin exactly 1 inch, and smiled. Not the smile of a woman who had surrendered, but the smile of a woman who had just decided something irreversible. If you've ever watched someone destroy the wrong person, stay until the very end. Hit like. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The venue had been rented for $300,000, and it showed in every detail. The imported marble floors catching the light from chandeliers that had been shipped from Milan, the floral arrangements that cost more per table than most people earned in a month. The orchestra positioned near the east wing playing something classical and European that nobody in the room actually listened to. The Chicago Meridian Grand was the kind of place that existed to remind people who they were, and more importantly, who they were not. Naomi had chosen the venue herself. She had negotiated the rate, approved the floral design, coordinated with the catering director, and personally reviewed the seating arrangement 3 times to ensure that the table placements reflected the right political geometry. Because in Damian Volkov's world, where you sat was a statement of rank, and rank was everything. She had done all of this without being asked, without being thanked, and without expecting either. That was the shape of their marriage. She provided the architecture. He inhabited it like it had always been there. She was standing near the bar when she felt the shift in the room. It was subtle, a ripple in the noise, a few conversations dropping half a register, the orchestra sliding into something softer without being directed to. Naomi had learned, in 11 years of living beside a man who generated a specific kind of atmospheric pressure, to read those shifts the way a sailor reads weather. She set her glass down on the marble bar top without hurrying and turned. Damien was crossing the ballroom floor from the direction of the private reception room, and he was not alone. She was with him. Lena Marsh, 31 years old, with the kind of beauty that required significant maintenance and the kind of ambition that required no maintenance at all. It ran entirely on its own fuel. She had come into their orbit 14 months ago as a corporate liaison for one of Damien's legitimate holdings, and she had made her intentions clear within the first 60 days. Not through subtlety, but through the complete absence of it. She touched his arm when she didn't need to. She spoke to Naomi with the particular politeness of a woman who wanted you to know she considered you an inconvenience. Naomi had said nothing. She had filed the information away, the way she filed everything, quietly, precisely, in a place she could access later. Lena was wearing a dress tonight that should not have been permitted at a charity gala. It was red in a way that was not accidental, cut in a way that invited commentary, and she wore it with the specific confidence of a woman who had already been told by the man beside her that she looked extraordinary. She had her hand in the crook of Damien's elbow, and she was scanning the room with the expression of someone doing an inventory. Her gaze found Naomi and settled there for exactly 2 seconds before she leaned up and said something quietly into Damien's ear. He laughed. It was his social laugh, the one he deployed when he wanted the people around him to know that he was at ease and they should be grateful for it. It didn't touch his eyes. Nothing Damien found genuinely funny ever announced itself that loudly. Naomi straightened her posture and picked up her champagne glass again. Around her, people were watching, because in a room full of people who made their careers from reading situations, this one was readable. She could see it on their faces. The careful neutrality of associates who had chosen sides already and were now waiting for something to happen, and the barely concealed appetite of those who had not chosen sides and were hoping for a reason to. She had worn midnight blue tonight, a structured gown with a low back, her dark hair pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck. No excessive jewelry. A single strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother, diamond studs, and the watch Damien had given her on their 5th anniversary that she'd continued to wear because she had liked the watch before she'd stopped liking the man who gave it to her. She looked, she knew, exactly like what she was, a woman of precise and deliberate elegance. She had cultivated that image the same way she cultivated everything else in their shared life, carefully, over years, understanding that image was not vanity, but strategy. Damien brought Lena directly to the center of the room, where a cluster of their most important guests had gathered. Raymond Kask, who ran 3 shipping concerns and laundered money through all of them. Felix Doran, whose legal firm processed the paperwork that made Damien's less legitimate enterprises look like legitimate ones. The aldermen, whose name Naomi had learned not to say aloud in certain contexts. And their wives, and their associates, and the various satellites that orbited men like these, all of them turning, adjusting, rearranging themselves in the unconscious choreography of people who understood power and wanted proximity to it. Naomi moved. She did not hurry. She navigated the room with the ease of a woman who had done it 1,000 times, stopping briefly to exchange a word with the director of the foundation they were ostensibly here to support, accepting a compliment on the venue's decor with a practiced smile, shaking a hand, touching an arm. By the time she reached Damien's group, she had covered 40 feet in a way that looked entirely unhurried. "There she is," Damien said, and his voice had the warmth in it that he used for performance. He extended an arm toward her and she came to stand beside him, and he kept his arm around her waist in the manner of a man displaying something he owned and was briefly choosing to acknowledge. "You remember Lena," he said. "Of course." Naomi extended her hand and Lena took it with a grip that was just slightly too firm. "Good evening." "Naomi." Lena's smile had a quality to it like a surface that looked solid but wasn't. "You look tired. Is the gala planning wearing on you? I know how much work you put in." The compliment was shaped like one but functioned as something else entirely, and everyone in the immediate circle understood that. Naomi felt Raymond Cask shift his weight, almost imperceptibly. Felix Doran's wife looked at her champagne. "I feel perfectly fine," Naomi said. Her voice was level. "Thank you for asking." Damien's arm tightened at her waist by a fraction. Not in reassurance, she understood, but in impatience. He had a low tolerance for social friction that he hadn't initiated himself. "Lena was just telling me about the Hargrove account," he said, pivoting the conversation with the bluntness of a man who didn't care that the pivot was visible. "Looks like we're going to finalize that acquisition before the end of the quarter." "That's faster than projected," Naomi said. "Lena moved some things around." He said it with a particular lightness, a sort of generous attribution that he extended toward Lena in the same tone he'd once used to credit Naomi for things she'd done. The room heard it. Naomi heard it. "She has a talent for identifying the inefficiencies." "Does she?" It wasn't a question. Lena's smile hadn't wavered. She was watching Naomi with something that was almost open curiosity, the way you might watch an animal you'd been told was dangerous, but couldn't quite bring yourself to be afraid of. "I just see things clearly," she said. "I think sometimes people who've been in a situation too long stop being able to see it at all." There it was, laid out as plainly as Lena was capable of laying anything out, which wasn't very plain at all. It was wrapped in enough conversational deniability that if challenged, she could look wounded and surprised. But it was there, and it landed, and the circle around them felt the landing. Raymond Cask reached for his drink. The alderman said something quietly to the man beside him, without taking his eyes off Naomi. Naomi let the silence run 2 full seconds before she said, "That can happen. It's one of the dangers of becoming comfortable." She looked at Lena with perfect pleasantness. "The important thing is recognizing when a situation has outgrown you." Lena's smile went very still. Damien's hand dropped from Naomi's waist. She felt it before she registered it consciously. The withdrawal of contact, the repositioning of his body, a centimeter of space opening between them that carried the weight of a decision. She had felt that particular movement before, in smaller moments, in private. The quiet way he communicated that she had said the wrong thing, overstepped, been something other than decorative in a moment when he'd wanted decoration. But they had never been in a room this full, with this many people watching, and he had never done what he did next. He turned to face her. The shift in his expression was subtle but total. The social warmth gone, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. The face he wore when he wanted a room to understand the hierarchy of things. "I think," he said, and his voice carried in the way he knew it would, in the way all men like Damien had learned to make their voices carry when they wanted the message delivered broadly, that Naomi has had a little too much to drink. The orchestra was still playing. The sound felt very far away. "I'm on my second glass," she said. "You always did handle it poorly." He said it conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather, as if there were no 500 people within earshot, as if the sound of it hadn't already reached the ears of every person within 20 feet. He turned back to Lena then, dismissing Naomi mid-sentence, mid-presence, the way you turn off a television that's been saying something you don't want to hear. Naomi did not move. Her champagne glass was in her hand, and she kept it there, and she breathed, slow, even, the kind of breathing you had to instruct your body to do when your body was operating on adrenaline and humiliation, and a rage so clean and cold it barely felt like rage at all. It felt like clarity. Felix Doran's wife was looking at the floor. Raymond Kask had turned his body 45 degrees, enough to communicate that he was removing himself from the immediate situation without physically moving. The alderman had not looked away. He was watching her with the flat attention of a man who was making a file of this. Then Lena said it. Later, Naomi would think that Lena had planned it, that she had been carrying it the whole evening, the way you carry a weapon you're waiting for the right moment to use. But in the moment it arrived, it didn't feel planned. It felt like recklessness, which was perhaps what it was. Damien, Lena's voice was light, almost playful, calibrated for exactly the radius of people surrounding them. Maybe this is the time to just say it. To say what the situation actually is, don't you think? She paused for the precise length of time required to let everyone understand what was being asked. Doesn't she deserve that at least? The room's noise dropped further. Someone near the back had not gotten the message and laughed at something. A bright, inappropriate sound that cut off almost immediately when the person sensed the surrounding silence and stopped. Damien looked at Lena. Something passed between them. An agreement, a permission, the kind of communication that existed between people who had made decisions in private that they were now prepared to make public. Then he looked at Naomi. He said, "She's never meant anything to me. She was useful. That's all she ever was." The words hit her with a physical quality, the way words do when they've been said in front of witnesses, when the saying of them is itself part of the act, when they're designed not just to convey meaning but to mark someone, to leave a visible register of where the speaker's contempt had landed and for how long it had been sitting there, gathering weight. Around them, the silence had the texture of held breath. Someone near the bar made a small, involuntary sound. The orchestra, which had not been given the signal to stop, continued playing something that now felt grotesquely inappropriate. A waltz, elegant and indifferent. Naomi looked at her husband. She had been looking at him for 11 years, in all kinds of light, in all kinds of circumstances. She had watched him conduct business across tables from men who scared other men. She had watched him sleep, which was the only time his face ever looked uncalculated. She had watched him charm rooms, manipulate allies, punish disloyalty with methods she had told herself not to think about too directly. She had watched him and known him and, for a portion of those 11 years, believed that knowing him as well as she did was a form of power in itself. She had not been wrong about that. She set her champagne glass down on the nearest surface. A server passed at precisely the right moment, and she placed it on his tray without looking. And she smoothed the front of her gown with both hands, the gesture unhurried, almost meditative. The room was watching. She could feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes, the way you feel weather change on your skin, a pressure shift, a drop in temperature. She looked at Damien for one more second. His face was arranged in the expression he wore when he was certain of his position, jaw set, shoulders back, the confidence of a man who had spent decades being the largest and most dangerous thing in any room he entered, and who had forgotten to consider that the woman standing across from him had spent 11 years learning the architecture of his danger and quietly memorizing every door. She smiled. It was not the smile he expected. He expected tears, or silence, or the particular controlled expression of a woman performing dignity under pressure. He did not expect the smile she gave him, not warm, not wounded, something altogether quieter and more considered, the smile of a person who has just confirmed something they had suspected but hoped was untrue. Then she turned and walked away. She did not hurry. She kept her shoulders level and her pace even, and she crossed the ballroom floor the same way she had arrived, with the ease of a woman who belonged everywhere she chose to stand, which was not performance. It was simply the result of having long ago decided that her dignity was hers to carry and no one else's to remove. The crowd parted around her. Some people looked at her. Most looked away. She walked past the floral arrangement she had chosen, past the seating card she had designed, past the strings of light she had approved, and the catering station she had organized, and the foundation's banner she had commissioned from a graphic designer in Wicker Park who had done excellent work. She walked through the lobby with its imported marble and its chandelier light, and she stepped through the main entrance into the October cold without stopping for her coat. The valet attendant moved toward her. "Mrs. Volkov." "I'll walk," she said. He hesitated. She was already moving. The street was quiet relative to what she'd left behind. Chicago in October had a specific quality. The cold with an edge to it, the city going about its business, the sounds of the gala muffled behind the venue's heavy doors, and then gone entirely as she moved further along the sidewalk. She walked without direction for 3 blocks, her heels on the concrete, her breath coming out in small, visible clouds in the cold air. She stopped at a corner, stood there. Let the cold come fully against her arms, her bare back, the parts of her the gown didn't cover, and breathed it in. Her cheek was still warm from where his hand had connected with it. She had not fully registered that until now. In the room she had registered only the sound, the shock, the immediate chemical response of her body, and then she had locked all of it behind a door that she knew very well how to close. But now, on the street, she allowed herself to feel it, the heat of it, the specific quality of that particular humiliation, a man hitting a woman in front of 500 people, not out of genuine rage, but out of performance, out of the calculated desire to mark her as something less than what she was, to diminish her publicly in a way that would circulate through every room she entered afterward. She thought about the 11 years. She thought about the account she managed, the legal crises she had navigated quietly and without credit, the alliances she had built and maintained through sheer relational intelligence, while Damien conducted himself with the blunt force of a man who could afford to be blunt because someone else was doing the delicate work. She thought about the attorneys who called her when they couldn't reach him because they knew she was the one who actually knew the answers. She thought about the accountants who deferred to her judgment on restructuring decisions because they had learned over time that her judgment was more reliable than his. She thought about Marcus Webb, who ran the most important of Damien's legitimate financial operations, and who had told her once, in the privacy of a conference room, that the company would be in federal court without her. She thought about all of that, and she stood on the corner in the October cold, and she felt something in her chest complete itself. A decision that had perhaps been forming for years, assembling itself piece by piece in the architecture of her patience, and that was now, at the corner of Michigan and Ontario, with the wind coming off the lake, finally finished. She pulled her phone from the small evening bag she'd carried, and she found the contact she needed. Not an attorney, not an accountant, not anyone connected to Damien's world, and she wrote a text message that was 9 words long. "I need to meet with you tomorrow. Breakfast." She sent it. She put the phone away. She looked down the length of the street at the city doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous, the lights of it bleeding upward into the low clouds. The reply came in 40 seconds. 8 o'clock. "I'll be there." She put the phone back in her bag and stood in the cold and let the last of the evening's warmth leave her cheek. There was something that happened inside her in that moment. Not the dramatic cracking open that it might have been in another woman, in another story, in a version of events that required its protagonist to perform her breaking down for the audience. What happened in Naomi Carter was quieter and more structural than that. It was the sound of a load-bearing wall deciding to become a door. She hailed a cab. In the back seat, the driver had the heat on too high and the radio playing something with a lot of bass that she couldn't identify. She gave her address, not the house she shared with Damien, the house in Lincoln Park with the 6 bedrooms and the wine cellar and the kitchen she'd renovated 3 years ago because she'd wanted it right, but the address of the apartment in River North that she had leased under her maiden name, Carter, 18 months ago. The driver didn't comment. He drove. She watched the city pass outside the window, and she did what she always did when she needed to think clearly. She made a list in her head of what she actually had and what she actually needed, and what the sequence of events would need to be. She ran the list with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, the same capacity for planning that had made her indispensable to a man who had just stood in front of 500 people and announced that she had never been anything to him. She thought, he has no idea what he just did. Not to her dignity, not to her feelings, to himself, to his business, to the careful, load-bearing web of relationships and financial arrangements and legal structures that had been held together for more than a decade, largely by her. He had no idea what he'd just done because he had never actually looked at what she did. He had used the results of it the way you use infrastructure without ever thinking about the engineering. Roads are there, water comes out of taps, lights turn on. He had never once considered the alternative. He was about to. The cab pulled up to her building and she paid in cash. She had always paid for this apartment in cash. And she stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked up at the building for a moment, at the lit windows in the upper floors, at the way the city behind her threw its light against the glass. Inside, she took the elevator to the 14th floor. The apartment was exactly what she needed it to be. Not large, not lavish, furnished simply with things she had chosen for herself rather than for the management of an image. A good desk, a good bed, the kind of kitchen that worked, books she had actually read. On the desk was the leather portfolio she kept here, and inside it the legal pad where she had, over the past several months, been writing things down. Not a plan. She hadn't been calling it a plan, because to call it a plan would be to admit she had already known, in some operational layer beneath the surface of her daily life, that this moment would come. She called it a framework. She sat down at the desk and opened the portfolio and found the legal pad and uncapped a pen. At the top of the first clean page, she wrote a date, tonight's date, the date of the Chicago Meridian Grand Charity Gala, the date of the $500 a plate dinner for a foundation whose board she chaired, the date her husband had struck her across the face and told a room full of witnesses that she had never meant anything to him. Below the date, she wrote one line. It starts now. She stared at that for a moment. Then she turned to the next page and began to write in earnest. Names, numbers, sequences, the architecture of what came next, laid out in the clean and systematic shorthand she'd developed over years of managing things that required managing. The pen moved across the paper without hesitation. Outside the 14th floor windows, Chicago went on being Chicago. The lake wind moved through the streets and the lights blazed against the low sky, and somewhere across the city, at the Chicago Meridian Grand, the gala was still happening. The orchestra still playing, the champagne still circulating, 500 people still processing what they had witnessed and calibrating what it meant for them and their relationship to the man who had done it and the woman who had walked away. Naomi wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. Then she put down the pen and looked at what she'd written. 3 pages, front and back, structured and precise. And she thought about Marcus Webb, who would meet her for breakfast in less than 12 hours. She thought about Dara Choi, the attorney who had handled her private legal matters for 6 years and who owed her in several ways that were not monetary. She thought about the 9 institutional investors she had personally cultivated over 4 years of patient relationship management, who had invested in Volkov Holdings primarily because she had convinced them it was worth their confidence. She thought about all the doors she had built in the architecture of Damien's empire that only she knew how to open. She picked the pen back up. She turned to a fresh page. There was a great deal of work to do, and she had always been, at her core, a woman who did the work. What Damien Volkov did not know, what he could not have known, because he had spent 11 years looking past her instead of at her, was that Naomi Carter had never needed him to survive. She had needed, for a time, the platform his world provided. She had needed the access, the resources, the gravitational field of his power, the way you might need a scaffold while a building goes up. But the building was up, had been up, fully realized and load-bearing for at least 3 years. She had just been waiting to see if it became necessary to live in it without him. The phone on the desk buzzed. She glanced at it, Damien's name on the screen. She let it ring. When the voicemail notification appeared, she did not listen to it. She set the phone face down on the desk and continued writing. The city pressed its light against the windows and the cold moved along the glass, and somewhere in the building above her someone was moving around, living their life. The normal sounds of a building at night, and Naomi Carter, who had built an empire for a man who had just publicly announced she was worthless, sat in the apartment no one knew she had and drew the outline of what came next. She was not angry. Anger was a resource she had learned not to waste. She was precise, she was organized, And she had by the time she finally capped her pen and folded her hands over the pages she'd filled. A sequence of events in her mind that would not look like revenge. Not to anyone watching, not from the outside, but would dismantle everything Damien Volkov had ever built with the clean, systematic efficiency of a woman who had built most of it herself. She looked at the last line she'd written. A name. An account number. A date 6 weeks from now. She thought about the smile she had given him, standing in the ballroom while 500 people waited to see what she'd do. She thought about the precise quality of his expression, the certainty in it, the dismissal, the confidence of a man who had mistaken her composure for submission and her silence for the absence of capability. She thought about how thoroughly he was about to learn the difference. She turned off the desk lamp. In the dark of the apartment, with the city's light coming in through the windows and the cold pressing against the glass, she sat very still for a moment. She was not a woman who prayed or sought comfort in abstractions. She was a woman who trusted structure and preparation and the cleanly applied pressure of a well-constructed plan. She trusted herself. She had built things before. She knew how it was done. She got up from the desk and walked to the window and stood looking out at the city. Her city. In a sense that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the decade she had spent learning how it worked, who it belonged to, and how power actually moved through it when no one was watching. And she allowed herself in private what she had not allowed herself in the ballroom but sent. Not tears, not rage, but something more controlled than both. A settling, a cold and complete conviction, the kind that doesn't announce itself but sits in your chest like something structural, like a foundation poured and cured. She would not be coming back. Not to the house, not to the marriage, not to the woman who had smoothed things over and managed the fallout and held the architecture together, while the man with his name on the building spent his time reminding everyone whose building it was. That woman had walked out of the Chicago Meridian Grand tonight. What was left was something else entirely. She turned from the window and went to bed. 6 weeks from now, the first account would move. In 9 weeks, the first attorney would receive a package. By the end of the quarter, the first cracks would be visible. And Damien Volkov, who had stood in a room of 500 people and announced that his wife had never meant anything to him, would begin to understand, slowly, systematically, in the specific sequence she had already mapped across 6 pages of a legal pad in a 14th floor apartment he didn't know existed, exactly what she had meant. He would understand it the way you understand infrastructure, only after it was gone. Marcus Webb was already at the table when she walked in. He had chosen a booth in the back of the diner on North Clark, away from the windows, which told her he'd understood the nature of the meeting before she'd explained it. Marcus was like that. He processed context the way a good accountant processed numbers, quietly and ahead of schedule. He was 53 years old, with the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged. And he was drinking black coffee and looking at nothing in particular when Naomi slid into the seat across from him. He looked at her face. At the left side, where the foundation she'd applied that morning covered what the cold compress last night had not fully reduced. He said nothing about it. That was also like him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You asked." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I came." The server appeared and Naomi ordered coffee and nothing else, and waited until the woman moved away before she leaned forward slightly and put both forearms on the table. Outside, North Clark was doing its morning business. Cabs, pedestrians, the rattle of a delivery truck. Normal city sounds. She found them useful right now, a kind of ambient cover. "I need to ask you something directly," she said, "and I need you to answer me directly. That's the only way I know how to talk. If I resigned from every position I currently hold in Volkov Holdings, every board seat, every advisory role, every operational function, what would happen to the Hargrove acquisition?" Marcus didn't move. His expression didn't shift the way most people's expression shifted when they were buying time. The micro-movements of the eyes, the slight compression of the lips. He simply looked at her steadily for 2 seconds and then said, "It would fall apart in 30 days. "Walk me through it." Hargrove's primary investor contact is you. Not Damien, not Felix's firm. You. Franklin Hargrove called you twice last month to discuss the valuation model, and he CC'd Damien as a courtesy, not because Damien was his point person. He set down his mug. "If you're gone," Hargrove calls the office, gets someone who doesn't know the relationship, Starts to wonder if the organization has the capacity he thought it had. He's already nervous about the timeline. He doesn't need more reasons to hesitate. And the Kellner portfolio? Same structure. You built those relationships personally over 3 years. The Kellner Group invested because of you. Their fund manager told me after the Q2 meeting, not to you, to me, in a parking garage, that they considered you the most competent person they'd encountered in Damien's organization. He paused. His words were, the only adult in the room. The coffee arrived. She wrapped her hands around it the same way he'd wrapped his, and she held it without drinking. How long, she said, has the operational side been running primarily through me rather than through Damien's direct management? He looked at her for a moment. You want a real answer. I wouldn't have asked for a decorative one. 4 years, he said. Maybe 4.5. Around the time Damien started spending more time on the other side of things. He meant the criminal operations, the side that didn't have conference rooms and quarterly reports, but that generated the cash that made everything else look clean. You pulled back from the daily operations around then, and you filled it. You didn't announce it. You didn't make a thing of it. You just handled it. Did anyone notice? Everyone noticed. Nobody said anything because the results were good and Damien wasn't asking. He looked at her steadily. I noticed. She drank her coffee. It was too hot, and she drank it anyway, feeling the burn of it move down into her chest, grounding. If I left, she said, and took nothing with me, no clients, no accounts, nothing, how long before the legitimate side showed serious structural problems? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He picked up his mug and turned it a quarter rotation and turned it back. Define serious. The kind that attracts attention. 6 months, he said. Maybe less if Damien makes any major moves without the relationships to support them. She nodded slowly. Naomi. His voice dropped a register, which was the closest Marcus Webb came to expressing concern. What are you planning? She looked at him. I'm planning to leave. That's not a plan, he said. That's a first step. She almost smiled. That's why I'm here. I need to understand what the first step costs him. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the diner moved through its morning rhythms, cups clinking, the short order bell from the kitchen, a man 2 booths over reading a newspaper with the focused dedication of someone who was avoiding going somewhere. Then Marcus said, I've worked for Damien Volkov for 11 years. I took the job because the money was good, and I told myself the rest of it wasn't my business. He rotated the mug again. I've worked with you for 11 years. That's a different thing entirely. I'm not asking you to do anything, she said carefully. I know. He looked at her over the rim of the mug. I'm telling you that when you leave, whenever that is, however that is, I leave too. I want you to know that before you factor me into whatever your calculation is. She looked at him for a long moment. She felt something move in her chest. Not sentiment exactly, but the recognition of something real, which was perhaps more valuable than sentiment. I'll factor that in, she said. She paid for both coffees and left the diner before 7:45, and she stood on the sidewalk in the morning cold for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets, breathing the city air, running the first page of the framework in her head. The number she called next went straight to voicemail, and she left a message. Dara, it's Naomi Carter. I need a private meeting, not about Volkov Holdings, about me, personally. Today, if you can manage it. Dara Choi called back before Naomi had walked 2 blocks. I heard about last night, Dara said without preamble. I assumed you would. Are you all right? I'm functional. A pause. Dara was 38, Korean-American, with a JD from Northwestern and the particular quality of attention that only the best attorneys possessed, the ability to listen to what wasn't being said and process it as information. She had handled Naomi's private legal matters for 6 years, quietly and with complete discretion, and she was the only attorney Naomi had ever worked with who didn't make her feel like she needed to explain herself. My office, Dara said. Noon. I'll clear the calendar. The morning moved quickly after that. Naomi went to the River North apartment and worked at the desk for 3 hours, not on the framework directly, but on the supporting documentation, The sequence of financial extractions that would be required to move her own assets cleanly out of any legal entanglement with Damien's holdings. She had structured her own investments carefully over the years, maintaining separation that was legitimate on its face, but that she had nonetheless been cautious about, maintaining detailed records, keeping her own counsel. She pulled those records now and went through them line by line, marking what was clean, what required legal confirmation, what needed to move in what sequence. At 11:15, her phone showed 4 missed calls from Damien. No voicemails after the first one, which she still hadn't listened to. At 11:30, it showed a text from a number she didn't recognize that said only, "We need to talk about what happened." She didn't respond. She put the phone in her bag and took the elevator down and walked to Dara's office on LaSalle. Dara's office had the particular quality of spaces designed to project competence rather than warmth. Clean surfaces, no unnecessary ornamentation, a view of the street through windows that were floor to ceiling and coated with something that kept the light manageable. Dara herself was behind her desk when the assistant showed Naomi in, and she stood and came around the desk and took both of Naomi's hands briefly, which was not something she did with clients she was performing professionalism for. It was something she did with people she actually knew. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what you need." Naomi sat. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Dara and said, "I need to understand exactly what I'm entitled to under Illinois divorce law, given the nature of our marital asset structure. I need to understand how my own independently held assets are protected, and I need to understand whether there are any legal exposure risks to me, personally, based on my work within Volkov Holdings over the past 11 years. Dara didn't write anything down yet. She looked at Naomi for a moment. On the third one, exposure risks. What are we talking about? What kind of work? Financial management, strategic oversight. I was not involved in the other operations. She held Dara's gaze. I managed the legitimate side. I kept it clean. That was in part what I was doing, maintaining separation between the clean businesses and the rest of it, so that the clean businesses stayed clean. Do you have documentation of that separation? Your own records, independent of whatever Volkov Holdings keeps? Yes. How comprehensive. Thorough enough that they tell a clear story about what I touched and what I didn't. Dara nodded slowly. She picked up a pen, which meant they were in it now. Okay, walk me through the asset structure. Everything you personally own independently of the marriage. They worked for 2.5 hours. Naomi laid it out with the systematic clarity she brought to everything she considered important, and Dara took notes and asked questions and occasionally held up a hand and said, "Hold on," and thought for a moment before asking a more specific question. By the time they finished, Dara had 12 pages of notes and an expression that was carefully neutral, but that Naomi had learned to read as the expression of someone who had just understood that the situation was more complex and more interesting than they'd initially assumed. Your independent holdings, Dara said finally. They're significant. Yes. Damien is aware of them. He's aware they exist. He's not aware of the scope. She paused. He stopped paying attention. Dara looked at her notes. The marital assets are going to be complicated. The legitimate businesses are legally distinguishable from the other operations, but in practice the cash flow has been intermixed in ways that will require forensic accounting to fully untangle. That's not insurmountable. It's time-consuming. She looked up. On your personal exposure, but based on what you've described, you have a defensible position. You are operating in the legitimate sphere, maintaining separation. Your documentation supports that. It doesn't make you untouchable, but it makes you someone who cooperated with proper practice rather than someone who looked the other way. I need that position to be ironclad, Naomi said. Not defensible. Ironclad. Dara looked at her for a moment. That's a different ask. I know. That requires proactive engagement with certain parties rather than reactive defense. I know, Naomi said again. Another silence. Outside, LaSalle Street went about its business. Dara put her pen down flat on her notepad and looked at Naomi with an expression that was precise and considered. You're talking about getting ahead of any potential federal interest. I'm talking about ensuring that if there is ever federal interest in Damien Volkov's operations, my name appears in the column of people who maintained clean hands, not the column of people who benefited from dirty ones. That's a significant step. Everything I'm about to do is a significant step. Dara looked at her for another long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the particular definitiveness of a person who has just made a decision they intend to keep. All right, I'll need the documentation. Everything you have. I'll need 2 weeks to structure the approach properly. And Naomi, she leaned forward slightly. Once we start this process, the direction it moves in it has momentum. Do you understand what I'm saying? It becomes very difficult to stop. I'm not planning to stop. Dara held her gaze. Then we start. Naomi took the documentation she'd brought in a sealed envelope and passed it across the desk, and Dara took it and held it and looked at it for a moment the way people look at things they understand to be significant. Then she put it in her desk drawer and locked it. The rest of the afternoon moved without incident. Naomi went back to the River North apartment and continued working. She ate nothing until 7 o'clock, when she made coffee and sat back down at the desk, and realized that in 31 hours since leaving the Chicago Meridian Grand, she had cried exactly 0 times, which was not suppression. She had checked a few times to see if it was waiting for her, but something else, something flatter and more certain. She did not think about Damien's hand against her face. She thought about the spreadsheet open on the laptop in front of her, and the names in column B and the amounts in column C, and the sequence in which the columns would need to be activated. She thought about Marcus Webb saying 4 years, maybe 4.5. She had not known until he confirmed it that the dependency had been so complete, so structural, for so long. She had known she was useful. She had not known she had become, in the operational reality of Damien's empire, essentially the load-bearing wall. She thought about what happened to buildings when load-bearing walls were removed. At 9:17, her phone rang. Not Damien this time. Raymond Kask. She looked at the name on the screen for a moment and then answered. Raymond, she said. Naomi. His voice was careful in the way it got when he was moving around something he wasn't sure how to approach directly. Raymond Kask was 61 years old and had been in business with Damien for 12 years and had never once, in all of those 12 years, called her directly about anything. He had always worked through Damien. He had deferred to Damien in every room she'd ever seen them in together. I'm calling because I wanted to. I wanted to reach out after last night. That's kind of you. It was... He stopped. She could hear him deciding how to say it, what words would carry the right weight without committing him to a position. It was unnecessary. What he did. Yes. Are you I'm fine, Raymond. What did you want to tell me? A pause. She heard him breathe. Castellan Capital called this morning, he said, about the distribution arrangement. They had questions I couldn't answer, and I told them you'd been unavailable, and they said they preferred to wait until you were available to continue the conversation. There it was. She filed it, cleanly. I appreciate you letting me know. Naomi, his voice dropped. Whatever is happening, between you and Damien, I want you to know that I consider you a separate party. From him. Always have. I know, she said. And then, because it was true and because she had always respected Raymond, even when she'd disagreed with him. Thank you, Raymond. That means something. She hung up and wrote Castellan Capital at the bottom of a page and put a small mark beside it. 3 days passed. She stayed out of the house. She had a go-bag she'd kept in the River North apartment for 8 months. Not because she'd planned to leave, she had told herself, but because she liked to be prepared. And she lived from it. She bought what she needed without using the credit cards attached to their joint accounts. She had her own cards, her own accounts, and she used those. On the second day, Damien stopped calling. On the third day, Lena Marsh began calling instead. The first call Naomi let go to voicemail. Lena's voice on the message was carefully modulated, warm in a way that was purely constructed. Naomi, it's Lena. I just wanted to check in. I know things are complicated right now, and I don't want there to be... I think we should talk. Woman to woman. She said woman to woman with the particular emphasis of someone who had decided that phrase was powerful and had not yet been told otherwise. The second call came 6 hours later. This time, Lena didn't bother with the voicemail. She sent a text instead. "He's worried about you. We both are." Naomi read it and put the phone face down on the desk and kept working. On the fourth day, she drove to Lincoln Park and entered the house she shared with Damien for the first time since the gala. She had timed it. She knew his schedule, had managed it for years, and she arrived at 2 in the afternoon when he was across town in a meeting that would run until 4. She had 2 hours. She moved through the house with purpose, taking exactly what she needed. Specific documents from the home office that were hers, personal items, the jewelry that predated the marriage. She had a list, which she followed without deviation, and she worked quickly. The house felt different in his absence in a way she hadn't expected, not emptier but more itself, as if his presence had always imposed a kind of pressure that she'd normalized so completely. She'd stopped feeling it until now. Without it, she felt the absence of that pressure and recognized it for what it was. She was in the home office, removing a folder from the lower drawer of the filing cabinet when she heard the front door. Her body went still before her mind caught up. A full second of animal response, the breath held, the muscles locked. His voice in the entrance hall. "Told him it wasn't going to happen on that timeline. That's final." A pause. He was on the phone. She straightened. She put the folder in the bag she'd brought. She closed the filing cabinet drawer and picked up the bag and walked out of the office into the hallway. He was standing at the base of the stairs, still in his coat, phone to his ear, and he turned when he heard her footsteps, and his face went through something. Surprise, then a rapid and poorly concealed recalibration, the specific expression of a man who had been caught not knowing what to feel. He lowered the phone without ending the call. "Hold on," he said into it, and lowered it to his side. They looked at each other across the length of the hallway. He was wearing the gray coat she had chosen for him 3 winters ago. He looked, she thought, precisely as he always looked. Large and composed and certain of his authority in every room he occupied. And she felt nothing in particular looking at him, which was perhaps the thing that would have surprised her most if she'd had time to be surprised. "You're here," he said. "I'm getting some things." His eyes moved to the bag on her shoulder. "What things?" "My things." His jaw tightened, a small movement. "We need to talk." "We don't." "Naomi. Damien." She said it flatly, without inflection, the way you say a word when the word itself is all you mean and nothing more. "I'm not having this conversation in the hallway. I'm not having this conversation at all right now." "You've been gone 4 days." "I'm aware." "Where have you been?" She looked at him. The question had a particular quality to it, but not concern. She could identify concern, and this wasn't it. It was control. The language of a man who was used to knowing the location of his assets. "That's not information I owe you," she said. Something moved in his face, a tightening that moved through his jaw and up into his eyes, the first stage of something he was working to contain. "You're my wife. You told 500 people I never meant anything to you." The silence that followed was different from the silences she was used to with him. This one had a quality of exposure in it. The sensation of a thing said in public suddenly being required to exist in private, without the audience that had made it feel powerful. He said, "I had too much to drink." She almost laughed. The almost laugh moved through her and passed without exiting, and she looked at him steadily. "You had half a glass of scotch before we arrived, and you drink significantly before you become impaired. You know that, and I know that." The tightening again. "I was... Damien." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "I didn't come here to have this conversation. I came to get my things. I'm going to finish doing that, and then I'm leaving. You can't just..." He stopped. He put the phone in his pocket. He'd forgotten the person on the other end, and she heard, distantly, the tinny sound of a voice that was being ignored. "We have obligations. You have obligations. The Hargrove meeting is next week. The Castellan situation is..." "I resigned from the board this morning," she said. He stared at her. "I sent written resignations from all 3 board positions before noon," she said. "Marcus has copies. Felix's firm has been notified." The color that came into his face moved from his collar upward, the specific flush of a man whose blood pressure had just changed quickly. "You can't resign without..." "I can. I checked. None of the positions have binding terms that require advance notice beyond 2 weeks for personal reasons, and I provided 2 weeks' notice in writing. She paused. I had Dara review the language. Something happened behind his eyes. A calculation occurring, fast and unpleasant, the specific expression of a man who is doing math in real time and not liking what the math says. Dara Choi, he said. You went to Dara Choi. She's my attorney. He stopped again, recalibrated again, and when he spoke again the tone had changed in the specific way that Damien's tone changed when he decided that one approach wasn't working and chose another. Softer, more considered, the voice he used when he was trying to recover ground. Naomi, I understand you're angry. What I said was, I'm not angry, she said. And she meant it in the literal sense, in the sense that anger was not the organizing feeling of what was happening in her chest. What was happening in her chest was more structural than that. It was the feeling of something that has been under significant pressure for a long time finding, finally, the release that allows it to return to its natural shape. Then what are you? He said. She thought about it for a genuine moment, not performing consideration, actually considering. Done, she said. She walked past him to the stairs, retrieved 2 more items from the bedroom that were on her list, came back down, and walked to the front door. He had not moved from where she'd left him. He was standing in the middle of the hallway with his coat still on and his phone in his pocket and his face arranged in an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Not anger, not coldness, not the public certainty he wore like a second skin. Something that might, on a different face, have been read as the beginning of fear. She didn't stay to watch it develop. She walked out of the house and didn't look back. The thing about structural damage is that it rarely announces itself dramatically. It doesn't collapse inward all at once, with noise and spectacle. It moves the way water moves through the wrong places, slowly, through small gaps, finding the paths of least resistance, accumulating in the walls of the building until the weight of it becomes, quietly, untenable. The first week after Naomi's resignations, the Hargrove acquisition stalled. She heard about it not from Damien, but from Marcus, who texted her 3 words. Hargrove called twice. She replied, "Let me know how it develops." 3 days later, Marcus called. Franklin Hargrove had requested a 3-month pause on the acquisition timeline pending organizational review, which was the language business people used when they'd lost confidence in someone but didn't want to say so directly. The second week, the Castellan capital situation became more complicated. Raymond Cass called her again, twice, within 36 hours, and she let the calls go to voicemail and listened to them afterward. His voice in the second one had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not panic. Something pre-panic, the register of a man watching something approach that he doesn't know how to redirect. She did not call him back. She was not being cruel, she was being structural. The thing she was doing did not look, from the outside, like anything in particular. She was not sabotaging Damien's operations. She was simply not propping them up. She was removing herself from the machinery with the clean efficiency of a technician removing a component from a system. And the system was responding the way systems responded when load-bearing components were removed. It was adjusting, poorly, to a weight it had never actually been designed to carry alone. Damien did not understand this yet. She knew that because Marcus told her, carefully, with the precision of a man choosing words with full knowledge of what he was doing, that Damien had responded to the Hargrove news by being angry at Hargrove's attorneys rather than by identifying the actual source of the problem. He had sent Felix Doran to manage the Castellan relationship, which was like sending a structural engineer to repair a plumbing problem, competent in his domain, completely wrong for the situation. He hasn't figured it out, Marcus said. They were having coffee again, same diner, same booth. It was 2 weeks and 3 days after the gala. He will, she said. When? When enough things fail that he can't explain them individually anymore and has to look for the common thread. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He's going to try to explain each problem separately for a while. The Hargrove thing is Hargrove's fault. The Castellan thing is Raymond's fault. He'll assign individual blame for each one because acknowledging the common thread requires him to acknowledge something he's not prepared to acknowledge. Marcus looked at her. That it was you. That it was never him. He was quiet for a moment. What happens when he gets there? He calls me, she said. He asks me to come back. And? She drank her coffee. I don't. He accepted this without further question, which was one of the things about Marcus she had always appreciated. He processed information and moved forward, rather than seeking emotional elaboration. On the 18th day after the gala, Lena Marsh sent a final message. It arrived at 6:47 in the evening, and it was longer than the others. 3 paragraphs, carefully worded, attempting a register of sincere concern that Naomi read with the clinical attention she might have brought to a legal document. The surface content was sympathetic. I know this isn't what anyone wanted, and I think Damien handles things badly when he's under pressure, but the structural content was different. It was a request for Naomi to return to the marital home, framed as concern for Naomi's well-being, which meant it was actually a request made on behalf of someone whose interests were materially served by Naomi's return. The message was not from Lena. The message was from Damien, expressed through Lena, which meant he had asked her to reach out, which meant he was beginning to calculate costs. Naomi read the message twice and put the phone down. She thought about Lena in the red dress at the gala, the calibrated provocation of that question. Doesn't she deserve that at least? The specific, confident cruelty of a woman who had assessed Naomi as a threat that could be neutralized by removal. She thought about how Lena had looked at her in that moment, not with genuine malice, but with something colder than malice, which was simple competitive pragmatism. Naomi was an obstacle. Remove the obstacle. She had not considered that the obstacle might remove itself in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Naomi wrote no reply. She deleted the message and went back to work. The call from Damien, when it finally came in the direct and unmediated form, arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the gala. She was at the desk in the River North apartment, and the phone buzzed, and she looked at his name on the screen and held the phone in her hand for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the decision of it. She answered. I need to see you, he said. No preamble, no social management. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, or hadn't heard in a long time, stripped of performance, running on something more fundamental. Why? She said. Because things are... He stopped. She heard him breathe. The Hargrove deal is dead. Castellan pulled their quarterly participation. Felix says the Kellner Group is asking questions we can't answer, and 3 of my people in the Western operations are talking to someone they shouldn't be talking to. She said nothing. Naomi. Her name and his voice had a different shape than it usually did. Not the dismissive efficiency of a man who addressed his wife the way he addressed a member of staff, but something rawer and less constructed. What did you do? I resigned, she said, from every position I held. That's not... His voice tightened. The Kellner Group doesn't pull back because a board seat changes. Castellan doesn't renegotiate because of a personnel shift. No, she said. They pull back because of relationships, because of trust that was built over time between specific people in specific ways, because the person they trusted is no longer present. Silence. Come home, he said. No. Naomi. Damien. She kept her voice even, because evenness was both what she felt and what the moment required. You told 500 people I never meant anything to you. You built that case in public. I'm simply allowing the case to be tested. She heard him breathe again. In, slowly. Out. The breathing of a man doing math he didn't want to do. What do you want? He said. She had been waiting for this question. Not eagerly. She felt no eagerness, nothing so volatile as that. But with the patience of someone who knows a door will open eventually and is prepared to walk through it when it does. Nothing from you, she said. I don't want anything from you. Then what is... I'm telling you, she said, and her voice was still even, still measured, still carrying not anger but something colder and more absolute, that I am not coming back. I'm telling you that the things you've been losing over the past 3 weeks are going to continue to leave because they were connected to me and not to you, and I am no longer available to hold them in place. I'm telling you that I have my own attorney and my own accountant, and my own plans, and none of them involve you. A silence that had a different texture from all the others, longer, thicker, the silence of a man who has been looking at a hole where a foundation used to be and is beginning to understand how deep it goes. You planned this, he said. I planned my departure, she said. The consequences are yours. She ended the call and set the phone on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. She felt the weight of the call settle through her. Not triumph, not grief, something more functional, the sensation of a structure being tested and holding. Then she picked up the pen. On the legal pad, she drew a line through 3 items that were now complete and wrote 2 new ones underneath. One was a phone number, the number of a woman named Catherine Osei, who ran a small but highly regarded investment consultancy in the West Loop, and who had told Naomi 18 months ago, over dinner, that she had always wanted to build something with her. The second item was a date, circled, 5 weeks from today. She looked at the date for a moment. Then she wrote, next to it, the name she intended to put above the door, Carter Financial Group. Not Volkov, not her husband's name, not the name she'd built her invisible architecture under for 11 years. Her name. Her father's name. The one she'd been born with. The one she'd set aside when she'd married and told herself it was a convention that didn't cost her anything. She looked at it on the page. She turned to the next page and began writing the business plan she had been composing, section by section, in her head for the past 3 weeks. The structure of it, the capital requirements, the strategic relationships she would bring with her, and the ones she would need to build from scratch, the market position, the differentiation strategy, the 3-year projection. She wrote it with the same systematic precision she brought to everything, and she wrote it fast because it was not a new idea. It was an idea that had been living in the back of her mind for years, waiting for the conditions that made it not just possible, but necessary. The pen moved across the paper, and the city pressed its light against the windows. And somewhere across Chicago, in the offices and conference rooms and private conversations of people who had done business with Damian Volkov for years, the information was moving through the networks it always moved through. About the Hargrove deal, about Castellan, about what Raymond Kask had said to his attorney, and what Felix Doran had said to his, and about the specific quality of absence that tends to draw attention when a presence that has been relied upon for a long time is suddenly gone. And Naomi Carter, who had spent 11 years being the kind of indispensable that no one acknowledged, was sitting in an apartment that didn't exist in her husband's understanding of her life, building the next thing with both hands. She did not know yet that in 9 days Damian Volkov would make the decision that changed the geometry of everything, that in 9 days he would announce, in a private dinner at Kask's house with 8 of his most important associates, that he intended to marry Lena Marsh, and that the announcement would land in that room with the specific quality of a stone thrown into water that is already dangerously unstable, and that Raymond Kask would look at Felix Doran across the table, and the look that passed between them would contain, in its precise and unspoken language, the beginning of the end of their loyalty. She did not know that yet. What she knew was the plan in front of her, and the pen in her hand, and the name on the page. Carter Financial Group. She circled it once, firmly, and kept writing. The announcement reached her on a Thursday morning through Marcus Webb, which was how she learned most things about Damian's world now, filtered through someone who understood both sides of the divide and had chosen, quietly and without drama, which side he was standing on. Marcus called at 7:52. She was at the desk in River North with coffee and the preliminary draft of the Carter Financial Group partnership structure open on the laptop, and she picked up on the second ring. He announced it last night, Marcus said, at Kask's house. Private dinner, 8 people. He's marrying Lena. She set down the coffee cup. She did not spill it, her hand was steady. Who was in the room? Kask, Felix Doran, the alderman, Brennan from the Eastern operations, 2 of his financial people, and Sokolov. A pause. Sokolov. She registered the name. Viktor Sokolov ran the largest independent criminal organization in the Midwest outside of Damian's own, a man Damian had maintained careful, arm's-length relations with for 6 years, the kind of diplomatic distance that acknowledged mutual power without inviting conflict. Sokolov's presence at an 8-person private dinner at Kask's house was not a social gesture. It was a statement of repositioning, of Damien reaching toward new alignments to replace the ones that were fraying. "How did the room receive it?" she said. Cask smiled, Marcus said. The kind of smile that doesn't mean what smiles are supposed to mean. Doran said congratulations, and then spent 40 minutes after dinner on his phone in the hallway. Another pause. Sokolov shook his hand. Sokolov was the only one in that room who seemed genuinely pleased. She absorbed this. She understood what it meant. Sokolov's pleasure at the announcement was not about Lena or the marriage. It was about what the announcement signaled. That Damien was destabilized, making moves driven by ego rather than strategy, reaching for a public declaration of victory at a moment when his operations were visibly contracting. Sokolov was pleased because a destabilized Damien was an opportunity. "Thank you," she said. "Naomi." Marcus's voice dropped. "This changes the timeline." "I know." Sokolov doesn't attend social dinners. He attends investment opportunities. "I know, Marcus." She ended the call and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes on the middle distance, not looking at anything particular, running the new geometry of it. The announcement was not itself the problem. She had expected, eventually, some kind of public declaration from Damien, some move that asserted his narrative over the one being told by the crumbling of his operations. What she had not fully anticipated was Sokolov. Sokolov's presence in that room meant that the vacuum she was allowing to form in Damien's operations was already attracting the kind of attention that could not be managed away. She had planned for controlled erosion. Sokolov represented something less controlled. She picked up the phone and called Dara. "I need to move the timeline," she said when Dara answered. "How much?" "Everything that was scheduled for the next 6 weeks. I need to know what can be accelerated." A pause on Dara's end that contained the specific quality of a lawyer running legal exposure calculations in real time. "The documentation package I was going to submit. I can have it ready in 10 days instead of 3 weeks. The personal asset transfers are already clean. Those are done. The question is the approach to federal interest. That requires a specific sequence, and I can't compress the sequence without creating gaps." "What gaps?" "If we move too fast, it looks reactive rather than proactive. The distinction matters enormously in how it's received." Dara's voice was precise, unhurried. "If it looks reactive, it looks like someone trying to get ahead of an investigation that's already started. If it looks proactive, it looks like a responsible party voluntarily providing information about practices they had concerns about. Those two things result in completely different outcomes for you." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "How much of the sequence is non-negotiable?" "The first contact has to come from me, not from you directly. The meeting has to appear requested rather than scheduled. And there has to be a gap between your departure from Volkov Holdings and the first contact, a gap that establishes you as no longer operationally connected. You've been gone 4 weeks. That's enough of a gap, but only if the first contact happens in the next 2 weeks, not in the next 2 days." 2 weeks, Naomi said. 2 weeks. She looked at the calendar on the wall above the desk, a plain one, the kind that came free from a hardware store, practical, with nothing on it except the marks she'd made in pencil. "All right," she said. 2 weeks, but I need us to be prepared to move the moment the 2 weeks are up." "I'll be ready," Dara said. She hung up and sat back in the chair and thought about Sokolov. She thought about his face. She had met him twice, at functions where their presence in the same room had been one of those unacknowledged coincidences that were not coincidences at all. And she had watched him the way she watched everyone, storing the information. He was a compact man, mid-60s, with the stillness of someone who had long ago made peace with patience as a weapon. He spoke less than anyone in any room he occupied, and the less he spoke, the more the room bent toward him, trying to fill the silence with things he might want to hear. She did not want Viktor Sokolov's attention directed at Damien's operations, while her name was still legally connected to any of them. She opened the laptop and went to work. The business plan was nearly complete. She had spent 3 weeks on it with the kind of focus she could only apply to things that felt, at the cellular level, necessary. Catherine Ose had responded to her call with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this phone call without knowing it was coming, and they had met twice in the West Loop office that Catherine was currently subleasing, and the outline of the partnership had taken shape with the ease of something that had been quietly inevitable: Carter Financial Group. The name was settled. The structure was two-thirds complete. The capital picture was manageable. Naomi's independent holdings, combined with Catherine's existing client base and a seed commitment she had secured from one of the Kellner Group's individual partners, acting in his personal capacity and not on behalf of the fund, would be enough to launch with credibility. Not luxury. There would be nothing lavish about the first year, and she had planned for that. But credibility. She had been, for 11 years, the invisible infrastructure of another person's credibility. She understood how it was built. She was 3 pages into the revised partnership structure when the buzzer for the building's front door sounded. She went still. Almost nobody knew this address. Marcus knew it. Dara knew it. Catherine had been given it last week. Those were the 3 people who knew it, and none of them would buzz without calling first. She walked to the intercom panel beside the door, pressed the button. Yes. A voice she recognized immediately, despite the static of the intercom and the distance of the lobby. It's Felix Doran. I need to talk to you. She stood at the intercom with her hand still on the button and felt her pulse do something she didn't permit herself to name. Felix Doran was Damien's attorney. He had handled the legal architecture of Volkov Holdings for 8 years. He had also, in his private capacity, been the person who had twice told Naomi, in hushed conference room conversations, that he considered his work for Damien to be the most morally complex professional relationship of his career, by which she had understood him to mean that it was the one he lost sleep over. Felix Doran should not have known this address. She pressed the button. How did you find this address, Felix? A pause through the static. I need 5 minutes, please. She made a decision she was not entirely comfortable with and buzzed him up. She unlocked the door and stepped back and waited, and when his knock came, she opened it. He looked like a man who had not slept well in several days. Felix Doran was 55, normally precise in his presentation. The suits, the haircut, the careful calibration of his professional persona. And those things were all still in place, but they had a slightly disheveled quality, like furniture that had been bumped and not quite straightened. His eyes moved around the apartment briefly before settling on her. You need to tell me how you got this address, she said. Damien had someone pull your credit activity, a card you used at the building's package service. She registered this with a flat, internal click. The click of a security assumption being revised. The card was in her maiden name. She had been careful. She had not been careful enough. Come in, she said, and stepped back. He came in and she closed the door, and they stood in the main room of the apartment, him with his coat still on, her with her arms crossed. Not defensively, just the posture she defaulted to when she was containing something. He knows where you are now, Felix said. I wanted you to know that before anything else. I understood that from your previous sentence. She looked at him. Why are you here? He reached into his coat and produced an envelope and held it out toward her. She did not take it immediately. What is that? Damien had papers drawn up, Felix said. Divorce filing. He's going to file within the week. But the settlement offer in there... He shook his head, a small movement that contained significant weight. Naomi, he's offering you 2% of the marital asset value, structured over 7 years. Non-negotiable language. She took the envelope. She held it without opening it. He can offer whatever he wants to offer. That's not why I'm here. Felix looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something uncomfortable for a distance and has decided to put it down. I'm here because I drew up those papers. I was instructed to draw them up, and I did, because that's my job. And then I sat in my office and looked at them and I thought about the past 8 years. He paused. And I thought about certain things I know. She waited. Damien is going to file for divorce on the basis of abandonment, Felix said. That's the legal framing. Abandonment and breach of marital obligation. His position is that you left the marital home without cause, refused reconciliation, and are responsible for business damages resulting from your voluntary resignation from company positions. His voice was even, but she could hear the thing underneath it. The discomfort of a man who had written language he knew to be bad faith. He's going to claim that your resignations were a deliberate act of economic sabotage. The word sabotage sat in the air between them. I see, she said. Naomi. He looked directly at her. If he makes that claim in a divorce filing, it becomes a matter of public record. It gets picked up, it gets discussed by the people in his world, and it shapes the narrative of why his operations have been struggling. He paused. He's not trying to win a divorce settlement. He's trying to establish a story in which you are the problem, the cause, the saboteur who damaged his business out of personal spite. She understood. She had understood before he finished explaining it, but she let him finish because he needed to say it, and because she was processing the full shape of it as he spoke, turning it in her mind. Why are you telling me this? She said. Felix looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. Because I drew up the papers, he said, and because the narrative he's constructing is a lie, and because I've known you for 8 years and I know what you built, and I know what he's attributing to you now is the inverse of the truth. He put his hands in his coat pockets, and because I don't want to be the attorney whose name is on documents that bury an innocent woman's reputation so a guilty man can avoid accountability. She stood with the envelope in her hands and felt the weight of this, not sentimentally, but practically. Felix Doran coming to her apartment to give her advance warning of Damien's legal strategy was not a selfless act divorced from self-interest. It was also, very probably, the action of a man who was beginning to recognize that the ship was taking on water and was assessing his own position on it. But that did not make the information less true. He knows about Dara, she said. Yes. Does he know what Dara has been preparing? Felix was quiet for a half-second too long, which was itself an answer. Felix. Her voice sharpened slightly. Does he know the specific nature of what Dara has been preparing? He suspects, Felix said. He doesn't have details, but he knows you hired Dara for something beyond divorce proceedings, and He stopped. Then, he's afraid of you. He would not describe it that way. He would describe it as being concerned about legal risk. But what I've watched in that office over the past 2 weeks is a man who is afraid. She looked at him. Who else has access to information about my legal activities? No one from my firm. I've handled Volkov Holdings exclusively through a firewall from your personal matters. That's how it's always been. But Damien has other people who are not attorneys and who are not constrained by the considerations that constrain me. She knew what he meant. She had always known what he meant when he used that particular circumlocution. She had been careful for 11 years not to think about it too directly. You need to be careful, Felix said. More careful than you've been. She looked at the envelope in her hands. She set it on the desk beside her laptop without opening it. Thank you, Felix, she said. I'll be in touch with you through Dara. He recognized the dismissal and accepted it. She walked him to the door and closed it behind him and stood in the room for a moment after the sound of the elevator arrived and then faded. She went to the window and looked down at the street. She did not see anyone watching the building, which meant nothing. If Damien had sent someone competent, she wouldn't. She thought about the credit card. She thought about the package service, which she had used twice in 3 weeks for deliveries she hadn't wanted going to the Lincoln Park house. One of those deliveries had been business documents. The other had been a coat she'd ordered because she'd left hers at the gala. The coat had cost her the address. She turned from the window and called Dara. Felix Doran just left my apartment, she said when Dara answered. He found it through my credit activity. Damien had someone pull it. A silence on Dara's end that had a very specific quality. The silence of an attorney recalibrating the risk assessment in real time. How much does Felix know about our preparation? He knows the general shape of it. He doesn't have details. Does he know the specific parties we've been in contact with? No. She paused. But Damien suspects we've been in contact with someone beyond divorce proceedings. Another silence. Longer. Naomi, if Damien has active surveillance on your financial activity, we have to assume he may have more. Are there any communications from the past 4 weeks that, if accessed, would... Everything sensitive has been in person or by encrypted channel, Naomi said, but I need you to move the timeline. I just told you 2 weeks. I know what you told me. I need you to listen to what I'm telling you. She kept her voice steady but let the weight of it come through. Damien is filing for divorce, claiming economic sabotage. If that filing hits public record before our documentation reaches the right people, the narrative is established in his favor. Everything that comes after looks reactive. Dara was quiet for 3 full seconds. "You're right," she said. "How fast can you move?" 72 hours, Dara said. "I need 72 hours to compress the sequence properly. There are going to be gaps, but I can manage them." "Manage them," Naomi said. "Do it." She hung up and stood in the middle of the apartment and looked at the legal pad on her desk, at the pages she'd filled with the framework, at the business plan, at the name Carter Financial Group circled in pencil. She thought about the sequence of the next 72 hours and what it required of her. Then her phone rang again. The number on the screen was one she didn't recognize. Not a contact, not a number she'd seen before, a Chicago area code, but nothing more. She looked at it for a moment, and something in her stomach went cold in the specific, instinctive way that bodies know things before minds do. She answered. "Mrs. Volkov," a man's voice said. Not Damien, not anyone she recognized. Low, accented at the edges, with something Eastern European, carefully controlled. "My name is not important. What's important is that I have information you need to hear." She said nothing. She stood very still. "Viktor Sokolov," the voice said, "has been in communication with your husband for considerably longer than last Thursday's dinner. 6 months, at minimum. The arrangement they've been developing involves the transfer of 3 of Damien's Western Territory operations to Sokolov's network in exchange for capital injection and legal protection infrastructure." A pause. "The capital injection has already happened, 4 weeks ago, routed through a holding company in Delaware." She thought, 4 weeks ago was the week after the gala. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because the holding company in Delaware also contains your name," the voice said. "As a silent partner, added without your knowledge or consent. The document is dated 8 months ago." The floor did not move. She was standing on solid ground in a 14th floor apartment in River North, and the floor did not move, but something else did. Something inside the architecture of the plan she had been building with such systematic care, a shift like a foundation settling, the wrong kind. "That's not possible," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of it. "The document exists," the voice said. "I've seen it. Your signature is on it, or a version of your signature that will hold up under initial examination. The kind of examination that happens quickly when someone calls in an anonymous tip about criminal financial operations and investigators are moving fast." She understood. She understood with a clarity that was almost physical. The shape of it, the geometry of it, the specific and deliberate construction of it. It was not a coincidence. It was not a reactive move. It had been prepared. The document, the holding company, the Delaware registration 8 months ago. It had been prepared well before the gala, before the public humiliation, before any of this. It had been sitting there like a piece of machinery waiting to be activated, and what activated it was her leaving. What activated it was the threat of her. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who has his own reasons for not wanting Viktor Sokolov to expand his territory unchallenged." The voice was precise, deliberate. "And someone who believes the most effective disruption of that expansion involves the people Sokolov is currently using. You want me to be the disruption. I want you to understand your situation clearly. Because if you don't understand it clearly, you're going to do what you've been planning to do. You're going to move your documentation through your attorney to federal parties. And when that happens, investigators are going to find a Delaware holding company with your name on it, and the conversation shifts very quickly from cooperative witness with clean hands to participant seeking favorable treatment." She sat down. She did not plan to sit down. Her legs made the decision independently, the body managing what the mind was occupied with. She sat in the desk chair and put one hand flat on the desk and breathed. "How long have you had this information?" she said. "Long enough to know it's real. Not long enough to have neutralized it before now. Can it be neutralized?" "The document can be challenged," the voice said. "The signature can be subjected to forensic analysis that would establish it as fraudulent, but that process takes time, and time in your current situation is the resource you have least of." She looked at the legal pad, at the circled name. "What do you want from me?" she said, flat, direct. She was done with the shape of things. A brief pause. "A meeting," the voice said. "Tonight. I'll text you an address." "I don't go to addresses sent by anonymous callers." "Then name a place," the voice said. "Somewhere public. Somewhere you're comfortable." She thought for 5 seconds. "The lobby bar at the Hamilton Hotel. 8 o'clock. I'll be there." The call ended. She sat with the phone in her hand and stared at the wall. She had designed, over the past 4 weeks, a plan of such systematic precision that she had begun in the quieter moments of its execution to feel the specific confidence of a person who has correctly identified all the variables. She had identified the relationships that mattered. She had moved the assets that needed moving. She had positioned herself, through Dara's work, to enter the next phase of this from a position of legal safety and reputational integrity. She had not identified the Delaware holding company. She had not identified the forged signature. She had not known that the mechanism meant to bury her had been assembled, piece by piece, 8 months ago, which meant it had been assembled before she had given anyone reason to need it, which meant she had been considered a threat before she had consciously become one, which meant Damien had understood something about her potential that she hadn't fully understood about herself. That was almost admirable. She didn't permit herself to find it admirable. She called Marcus. "Are you somewhere private?" she said when he answered. "Give me 30 seconds. She heard him move, heard a door close. "Yes." "Have you heard anything about a Delaware holding company? Anything at all? Anything that crossed your desk in the past year that involved a Delaware registration connected to Damien's operations and a third party?" A silence that ran longer than she wanted. "There was something," Marcus said slowly. 7, 8 months ago. A new entity appeared in some of the financial architecture. I noticed it because it was structured differently from the usual channels. Delaware registration, minimal documentation on my end, run through a separate accounting contact rather than through me. I raised it with Damien's financial person and was told it was a new investment vehicle and not in my operational scope. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Did you see who was listed in the entity?" "I didn't have access to the full documentation. I saw the entity name, Meridian Horizon, LLC, and I saw 2 names. Damien's was one of them." He paused. "I assumed the second was someone from the investment side, someone I didn't know." "It was mine," she said. Silence. "Marcus, I'm here. I need you to find out everything you can about Meridian Horizon, LLC, in the next 4 hours. Whatever you can access without triggering anything. Do you understand?" "Yes." His voice had gone very quiet and very focused. "Naomi, are you all right?" "I'm handling it," she said. She hung up. She sat in the apartment and let herself feel the full weight of the situation for exactly 90 seconds. She gave herself that. The honest acknowledgement of what she was facing, because she had learned a long time ago that refusing to feel a thing didn't make it absent. It just made it present in ways you couldn't manage. She felt the cold shock of the forged document, the specific nausea of her name attached to something she hadn't agreed to, the particular horror of seeing a carefully constructed plan revealed as having a floor that she hadn't known wasn't solid. 90 seconds. Then she got up from the chair. She went to the closet and pulled out the go bag she'd kept there and opened it and checked its contents. Cash, documents, the second phone she'd kept charged and unused, the small external drive with encrypted copies of everything critical. She had packed it 8 months ago and refreshed it monthly in the same way she maintained insurance on things she hoped she'd never need. She transferred 3 items from the desk to the bag. She changed out of the clothes she was wearing into clothes better suited to the evening. Dark, unremarkable. Nothing that would make her memorable in a hotel lobby. She looked at herself briefly in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back was composed and pale, and had the expression of someone who has just had the ground redrawn under them, and has decided, in the absence of any other viable option, to continue walking. She went back to the desk and picked up the phone and called Dara. 72 hours is too long, she said. I need 48. Naomi, what? There's a Delaware LLC called Meridian Horizon. My name is on the documentation as a silent partner. The documentation is forged. I need you to find it, establish the forgery, and have our information in front of the right people before Damien's divorce filing hits the record, or before whoever is moving the chess pieces here decides to use the LLC as a lever. She said it fast and clean, the way you said things when there wasn't time for the longer version. 48 hours, Dara. A pause on Dara's end that was not hesitation. It was a lawyer compressing and reorganizing a complex task in real time. Forensic document analysis takes time I don't have in 48 hours. Then establish the LLC's existence and my lack of knowledge of it. Build the factual record that I didn't know it existed. The forensic analysis can follow. That I can do, Dara said. I'll need everything you have on your financial activity for the past 12 months to establish what you were actually doing. I'll have it to you by end of day. She gathered the documents from the filing she kept in the apartment. 12 months of meticulous personal financial records, the kind of documentation she had maintained precisely because she had always understood that the nature of Damien's world made her proximity to it a liability she had to manage carefully. She had these records. She had always had them. She had kept them the way she kept the go bag and the encrypted drive and the apartment itself, against a contingency she hoped wouldn't arrive, but planned for anyway. The contingency had arrived. She packed the documents into a secure envelope, drove to Dara's office, left them with the night attendant under specific instructions, and was in her car heading toward the Hamilton Hotel 40 minutes before the 8 o'clock meeting. She sat in the car on a side street a block from the hotel and looked at the time on the dash, 7:22, and ran the variables. The anonymous caller knew about the LLC, knew about the forged signature, knew about her timeline with Dara. That level of knowledge required either access to Damien's inner operations or to Sokolov's, or both. The stated motivation, disrupting Sokolov's expansion, was plausible, but plausible was not the same as true, and she had not survived 11 years in Damien Volkov's world by treating plausible as true. She went into the hotel at 7:50 and chose a position at the bar that gave her a clear sightline to the lobby entrance and the elevator bank and the secondary exit. She ordered sparkling water and held it and watched people move through the lobby. At 8:03, a man walked in from the street entrance who moved the way people moved when they were checking the room before entering it fully. A brief pause, a sweep of the eyes, an adjustment. He was about 60, compact build, gray at the temples, wearing a dark coat, no expression she could read immediately. He found her. He moved toward her without hurrying and took the seat beside her at the bar and said, in the same voice from the phone, "Thank you for coming." "Tell me who you are," she said. "A former associate of Sokolov's who parted ways with him over a matter of competing interests." "That's a description, not a name." "The name isn't relevant to what I have to tell you." She held the glass of sparkling water and looked at him directly. "Everything is relevant. If you won't give me a name, give me something I can verify independently. Otherwise, this conversation ends." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that revised itself slightly. A man recalibrating his expectation of the person across from him. Then he said, "My name is Grigor Van. I was Sokolov's financial operations director for 4 years until 18 months ago. I left because I found out that Sokolov had authorized the use of my name on documentation I hadn't approved, in a situation that mirrors yours." She looked at him. "That's verifiable." "It is." "I'll verify it tonight." "I expected you would." He looked at the bar for a moment and then back at her. The LLC, Meridian Horizon, was Sokolov's structure, not Damien's. Damien provided his name and his access. Sokolov provided the architecture. The forged signature was added to the documentation 4 months ago, when your relationship with Damien began to publicly deteriorate. Sokolov watches these things. He saw an opportunity. She thought about the gala. The deterioration had not been public 4 months ago. 4 months ago, the tensions in their marriage had been visible only to people who were paying very close attention. Sokolov was watching Damien's operations that closely 4 months ago. "Sokolov has been watching Damien's operations for 2 years, Gregor Van said. "The Western Territory transfer didn't originate last Thursday. The dinner was a formalization. The process of acquiring Damien's territory began the moment Sokolov identified that the operational stability of Volkov Holdings was contingent on one person who was not Damien Volkov. The thing that moved through her was not surprise. It was the colder and more uncomfortable sensation of a recognition she should have reached earlier. "He was watching me," she said. He was watching the organization, Gregor Van said, and he identified you as the load-bearing element. And he understood that if you were removed from the equation, voluntarily or otherwise, Damien's operations would become vulnerable to acquisition. He looked at her steadily. The gala was not what Sokolov engineered, but when it happened, when you left on your own, Sokolov moved faster than he had planned, because the thing he'd been waiting to arrange, your removal, had happened for him. She stared at the bar for a moment, at the glass of sparkling water, the light moving through it. She thought about standing in the ballroom in midnight blue with Damien's voice carrying across 500 people, and she thought about the smile she had given him, the cold, finished smile of a woman who had decided something irreversible, and she thought about how it had felt like agency, her choice, her timing, her plan. Sokolov had been waiting for it. The forged signature, she said. What's its purpose? Insurance, Gregor Van said. If you cooperate with federal investigators, which Sokolov assessed you would eventually do, based on the attorney you retained and the documentation he suspected you were gathering, the LLC ties you to criminal financial operations. Your credibility as a cooperative witness collapses. The documentation you provide is compromised by your apparent involvement. The investigation stalls or shifts direction. And Sokolov's acquisition of Damien's territory proceeds without interference. Without the kind of interference that a credible, cooperative, clean-handed former insider could generate, Gregor Van said. Yes. She sat very still. The bar was populated around them, the normal noise of a hotel lobby bar in the early evening, conversations, ice against glass, the ambient music nobody had chosen. She was sitting in the middle of it, with her hands around a glass of water, and the understanding moving through her that the plan she had built, the careful architecture of 4 weeks, had been built on ground that someone else had already mined. She was not in a position she had chosen. She was in a position she had been maneuvered into by someone who had read her more accurately than she had read him, and the document with her forged name on it was sitting in a Delaware registration system right now, waiting for whoever needed to use it. She looked at Gregor Van. What do you want? She said. He reached into his coat and placed a small drive on the bar between them. Everything I have on Sokolov's financial operations, including the Meridian Horizon LLC, the Western Territory acquisition, and the documentation structure he's used to manage these transactions for the past 3 years. He left his hand off the drive, leaving it on the bar. In exchange for which I want 2 things. I want your attorney to establish my cooperation in whatever federal process follows, and I want the documentation I provide to be submitted in a way that ensures Sokolov, not Damien, not you, Sokolov, is the primary subject of the investigation. She looked at the drive. She did not touch it yet. You understand, she said, that I can't make promises on behalf of federal investigators. I understand that you can make representations about cooperation that carry significant weight, he said, with the right attorney making the right representations. She thought about Dara. She thought about the 48-hour window. She thought about the forged signature sitting in a Delaware filing and the divorce papers Felix had delivered, and Sokolov at the dinner table shaking Damien's hand with the satisfaction of a man who had been moving pieces for 2 years. She thought about the woman who had walked out of the Chicago Meridian Grand 4 weeks ago with the cold, finished certainty of someone who had decided something irreversible. That decision had been real. The certainty had been real. But the plan built on it had been built inside a situation she had not fully seen. And now she saw it, all of it, the full topography of it, the mines and the drop points and the architecture of the trap that had been laid not in response to her actions, but in anticipation of them. She picked up the drive. My attorney will contact you tomorrow, she said. She put the drive in her bag and stood up from the bar and put $40 on the counter and walked toward the exit without looking back. And she was through the lobby and out the main door and on the sidewalk in the October air. A different October than the one she'd stood in 4 weeks ago, colder now, the season further along. And she stood there for a moment with the drive in her bag and the weight of what she'd just learned pressing down through her chest. She was not the hunter she had believed herself to be. She was a piece on a board that someone else had been playing for 2 years. And the only way forward, the only path that led somewhere other than a Delaware holding company with her forged name on it, and a federal investigation that began and ended with her, required her to do something she had not planned for, had not prepared for, had not believed she would ever need to do. She was going to have to become, in the next 48 hours, not the careful and systematic woman who built things from the inside, but something else entirely. Something faster, something harder, something that was willing to use what she had in ways that left no margin and no fallback, and no version of this where she came out clean and composed and in control. She was going to have to be willing to burn it all down at once. Not the careful sequence, not the measured extraction, the clean hands, the proactive cooperation that looked considered rather than desperate. All of that was the plan of a woman who had time and margin and the luxury of controlling the pace. She had none of those things anymore. What she had was 48 hours, a drive with Gregor Van's data on it, a forged signature sitting in a Delaware filing, and an attorney who was good enough to work fast if she asked her to. She walked to her car and got in and sat in the dark for 2 minutes with the engine off. Then she called Dara. "I need you to listen to everything I'm about to say without interrupting me," she said when Dara answered. "And then I need you to tell me if it's possible, not comfortable, possible." "Go," Dara said. She talked for 11 minutes. She laid it out in sequence. Gregor Van, Sokolov, the Meridian Horizon LLC, the forged signature, the drive, the Western Territory acquisition, the 2-year surveillance, all of it. She talked the way she'd learned to talk in high-pressure situations, without filler, without the softening language that people used when they were afraid of how things sounded. Things sounded the way they sounded. The task was to manage them, not to make them sound better. When she finished, there was a silence on Dara's end of 4 full seconds. Then Dara said, "The drive." "Yes." "If the data on it is what Van says it is, the LLC documentation, the transaction records, the territory acquisition materials, and if I can establish provenance for it in a way that makes it admissible, can you? With the right contact in the right sequence, yes. But Naomi, listen to me." Dara's voice was precise and fast, the voice she used when she was moving at the speed of the problem rather than behind it. "What you're describing is not cooperation. What you're describing is offense. You're not walking in with your records and saying, 'Here's what I know.' You're walking in with a full operational picture of a major criminal expansion and a forged document that implicates you, and you're asking them to take both seriously simultaneously. That's..." She stopped. "That's aggressive. I know what it is. If it works completely. You're not just clean. You're the reason the whole thing unravels. Your name on that LLC becomes evidence of Sokolov's method rather than evidence of your involvement." A pause. "If it doesn't work, I know what happens if it doesn't work." Another pause. Shorter. "I need the drive. Tonight. I'm driving to your office now." She drove across the city with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and her mind running the sequence forward in the specific way she'd learned to run sequences when the variables were in motion. Not planning every step, which was impossible when the ground was shifting, but identifying the fixed points, the things that were certain regardless of how the variables moved. Fixed point 1. The drive had to reach Dara tonight. Fixed point 2. Dara's contact. She had one, a federal prosecutor she'd worked with 3 years ago on an unrelated matter, a woman named Hartley who had a reputation for moving fast when the material was right, had to receive the preliminary package before Damien's divorce filing hit the system. Fix point 3. Gregor Van's cooperation had to be secured in writing before he had second thoughts, or before Sokolov's people found him, whichever came first. She parked outside Dara's building and called up from the street, and Dara came down herself, rather than sending the attendant, which told Naomi that Dara understood the weight of the moment in the specific and practical way that good attorneys understood things, not emotionally, but operationally. She handed over the drive in the street, standing in the cold under the sodium light of the building's entrance, 2 women in their 40s conducting what looked from the outside like an unremarkable exchange. "Van needs to be in writing before morning," Naomi said. "I'll draft a cooperation framework tonight and send it to him by 6 a.m. His attorney will need to sign off, but if he's serious, he'll move fast." Dara held the drive in her closed hand. "The contact I have..." "Hartley. She's not someone who responds to phishing. She needs to see the full picture before she commits to anything, which means the package I send her needs to tell the story completely, not suggest it. Tell it. How long? I'll work through the night. You'll have a draft of the package by 4 a.m. I need you available by phone from that point. I'll be available? She drove back to River North and went upstairs and sat at the desk and did what she had always done when situations exceeded the comfort of planning. She worked. She pulled her own records again, cross-referencing them against what Van had told her about Meridian Horizon's timeline, building the factual chronology that would demonstrate with documentary precision that her name on that LLC was impossible, that on the dates the entity was formed and the document signed, her actual financial activity was demonstrably elsewhere, in transactions that had witnesses and records and timestamps that could not be reconciled with the participation the LLC claimed she'd had. She worked until 2 in the morning. She made one mistake in a calculation and caught it and corrected it and kept going. She did not eat. She drank coffee that went cold before she finished it. The city outside the windows did its late-night version of itself. Quieter, the traffic thinned, the sounds more isolated. At 2:47, her phone buzzed. Not Dara, a number she didn't know. She answered because at 2:47 in the morning, in the 48-hour window she was inside, unknown numbers were not things she had the luxury of ignoring. Mrs. Volkov, a different voice from Van's, younger, flat. You should know that Mr. Van had a visitor tonight. Her pen stopped moving. He's fine, the voice said. For now. But whoever sent the visitor wants you to understand that the drive you're holding is now a liability rather than an asset. Who are you? Someone passing on a message. The voice had the quality of someone reading rather than speaking. Not from a script exactly, but relaying rather than originating. The message is that the drive goes back. Whatever you've given to your attorney, you pull back, and you take the settlement your husband's attorney offered, 2%, 7 years. A pause. Or the visit to Mr. Van is followed by a visit somewhere else. She knew what somewhere else meant. She said, tell whoever sent you that I need 24 hours to consider. A pause. You have 12. The call ended. She set the phone down on the desk and looked at the wall. Her heartbeat was doing something it didn't usually do. Not racing, exactly, but heavier, each beat more present than normal, as if her body was marking time in a different way. She called Dara immediately. Someone visited Van tonight. I don't know his condition beyond fine for now. I've been given a 12-hour window with a threat attached. She kept her voice level. Does this change what you can do? Dara was silent for a moment. It means I need Van's cooperation document signed before morning instead of by morning. Another pause. Naomi, are you safe where you are? She looked around the apartment, at the window, at the door. She thought about Felix Doran finding the address through a credit card. She thought about the efficiency with which someone had located and visited Gregor Van. For the moment, she said. Don't stay there past 5 a.m., Dara said. Go somewhere else after that. Somewhere no card, no phone, nothing traceable. I know a place, Naomi said. She was thinking of Catherine Osei's office, not her apartment, her office in the West Loop, which was leased under the consultancy name and not under Catherine's personal identity, and which had no connection to Naomi in any documented form. I'll contact you through the encrypted channel only from here on, Dara said. No regular calls. She agreed and ended the call and sat for 90 seconds and then picked up the phone again and called Marcus. He answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. I've been awake, he said before she could speak. I found the Meridian Horizon LLC in the public filing system. Delaware, registered 8 months ago. 2 principals listed. My name. And Damien's. Naomi. His voice dropped to something below its already low register. There are 3 transactions associated with that entity in the past 4 months. 7 figures each. She breathed. Marcus, I need to ask you to do something that has legal exposure attached to it. Tell me. I need you to document every piece of financial information you have access to within Volkov Holdings that relates to the Western Territory operations. The acquisition, the capital movements, anything connected to Sokolov's name or any entity associated with him. Document it, copy it, and get it to Dara Choi by 4 a.m. A silence. Not hesitation. She knew his silences well enough by now to distinguish between hesitation and the pause of a man accepting the weight of a decision. "I can do that," he said. "Some of it I have access to legitimately. Some of it I'll have to—" He stopped. "I know," she said. "It's going to look like what it is," he said. "Someone pulling information before they leave." "Yes." "I'm leaving either way," he said. "Might as well leave with something useful." Another pause. "I'll be careful about the sequence." "Thank you, Marcus." "Don't thank me yet," he said. She packed what she needed from the apartment in 40 minutes. Systematic, the go bag, plus the documentation she'd been working on. Everything else left in place because taking everything would take too long, and what she needed was movement. She left River North at 4:15 a.m. and drove west with the city dark around her and the highway nearly empty, and her mind running clean and cold on the problem in front of her. She thought about the 12-hour window. She thought about what it meant. Not a genuine negotiating position. She understood that. 12 hours was the language of people who had already decided what they were going to do and were offering the appearance of an option to see if it would be taken. The drive going back would not make her safe. The settlement being taken would not make her safe. Those things would make her compliant, which was different. Compliance kept you in reach. She understood, on the highway at 4:20 in the morning with the city lights beginning to spread behind her, that the only version of this where she came out on the other side of what was happening was the version where the next 12 hours moved faster and hit harder than anything Sokolov's people were expecting. She pulled into the parking structure adjacent to Catherine Osei's office building at 4:55 and called Catherine from the car. Catherine answered in 3 rings, her voice alert in the way of someone who slept lightly by habit. "Naomi, I need to use the office, right now, today, as long as we need it. I'll explain when I get upstairs." A beat. "I'm 10 minutes away," Catherine said. "I'll meet you there." They worked from the office through the rest of the dark and into the gray early light of the morning. Catherine pulled her own laptop and her own institutional contacts and her own relationship network, and Naomi laid out the situation for her in the same flat and complete way she'd laid it out for Dara. All of it, the full picture. Because Catherine was about to be the co-founder of a company whose founding partner was currently inside a federal and criminal situation that would define whether the company ever existed. Catherine listened the way she always listened, with her full body, not just her attention, leaning forward slightly, her hands still on the table. When Naomi finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you need from me specifically?" "I need you to contact the Kellner Group," Naomi said. "Not the fund manager, the individual partner who committed personally, Brandt. I need you to call him this morning, and I need you to tell him that Carter Financial Group is moving its launch timeline forward, and that you'd like to confirm his participation before the end of the week, and that there are developments he should be aware of regarding Volkov Holdings that make the timing significant. You want him committed before the news breaks. I want everyone who is going to be associated with us committed before their perception is colored by whatever version of this story Sokolov or Damien manages to get into circulation first." Catherine nodded once, a single decisive movement. "I can make those calls by 8 a.m. There's one more thing." Naomi looked at her directly. "Whatever happens today, whatever comes out about Meridian Horizon and my name on it, you need to be prepared for that. It's going to look bad for approximately 48 hours before it looks like what it actually is." Catherine held her gaze. "I've been building financial structures for 20 years, she said. I know the difference between a forged document and a guilty person." A pause. 48 hours is manageable. At 6:38 a.m., Dara's message came through the encrypted channel. Package sent to Hartley. Van signed cooperation framework at 5:45 a.m. His attorney moved fast. Marcus's materials received, incorporated. Hartley has acknowledged receipt. Waiting. Naomi read the message twice and felt the specific sensation of a thing in motion. Not relief, not yet, but the recognition of momentum, the structure of the next thing beginning to take the weight she was putting on it. At 7:02, her regular phone rang. "Damien." She looked at it for a moment. She answered. "You have 6 hours left," he said. His voice was not the voice from the phone call 3 weeks ago, not the stripped, unperformed voice of a man doing math he didn't like. This voice was hard in a different way, the hardness of someone who had made a decision and was no longer equivocating about it. "I'm aware," she said. "I need an answer." "You'll have one." "Naomi." A pause. "I want you to understand something. What happens if you don't—" "Damien." She kept her voice completely even. "I want you to understand something. You have been managing what you think is a negotiation. You have been applying pressure to what you think is a position. But you built the pressure on the assumption that I'm trying to preserve something." She paused. "I'm not. I have nothing left to preserve. I have only what I'm building, and what I'm building doesn't require your cooperation or your mercy or your restraint. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Silence. "The settlement," he said. "No." "The drive is already where it needs to be," she said. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds and had a texture she had not heard before in a silence from him. Not the calculating silence, not the performative silence, not the silence of a man arranging his next position. Something that had more air in it, more exposure. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I made a mistake 11 years ago," she said. "I've been correcting it." She ended the call. Her hands were not shaking. She looked at them to check, both flat on the surface of Catherine's conference table, and they were steady, which surprised her at some level below the level where she was managing everything else. She had expected her body to be further ahead of her on this, expected the adrenaline to be running hotter by now. But what she felt was something closer to the opposite, a slowing, a narrowing, the specific contraction of perception that she had read about and now understood. The way extreme pressure didn't expand the mind but focused it, burned away everything that wasn't the essential thing, and left only that. At 8:51, Dara called on the encrypted channel. Voice this time, not text. "Hartley wants a meeting," Dara said. "Today. This morning. 11 o'clock. Naomi felt her chest do something she permitted herself to feel without naming. "Where?" "Her office. Federal building on Dearborn." "I'll be there." She looked at Catherine across the table. Catherine had been on her own phone for the past 40 minutes, moving through her contact list with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 20 years building relationships precisely because relationships were the actual infrastructure of everything. She lowered the phone when Naomi looked at her and raised her eyebrows in a question. "It's moving," Naomi said. Catherine nodded. "Brant confirmed," she said. "He's in. And I called 2 others, Reyes and the woman from the municipal fund, Park. Both said yes before I finished explaining the structure." Naomi looked at her. "Before the explanation." "They said yes to working with you," Catherine said. "The structure was secondary." She held that for a moment. Held it not sentimentally but practically, understanding what it meant. That the 11 years of invisible work, the relationships built carefully and maintained without expectation of credit, the reputation for competence and integrity that she had cultivated in the spaces Damien never looked at, those things existed independently of what was about to happen. They were not contingent on the outcome of the next 8 hours. They were already there, already real, already hers. She got up from the table and picked up her bag and said, "I have a meeting at 11. I'll call you when it's done." She drove to the federal building on Dearborn through mid-morning Chicago traffic. The city fully operational now. The density of it pressing in around the car, the noise and the movement of a Tuesday in a major American city that had no idea what was happening in its architecture right now, which was how it always was with the things that mattered most. They happened in offices and cars and encrypted phone calls and conference rooms while the city went about its business, and the city never knew until later. She parked and went in through the public entrance and gave her name and was taken, after a wait of 12 minutes, through a secondary door and down a corridor that had the specific quality of institutional spaces. Functional, deliberately unremarkable. The kind of hallway that told you efficiency was the priority and comfort was not. She was shown into a conference room and left there for 4 minutes, which she spent standing rather than sitting because she was not prepared to be walked in on while seated. The door opened and Sarah Hartley came in. She was 50, or close to it, with gray beginning at the temples and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where people were trying to manage what they revealed. It was not a hard face, but it was a calibrated one, economical with expression, storing more than it showed. She was carrying a file folder and a coffee mug, and she set both on the table and looked at Naomi for a moment before sitting down. "Miss Carter," she said. She used the maiden name, which meant she'd been thorough already. "Thank you for coming on short notice." "Thank you for moving quickly," Naomi said. She sat. Hartley opened the folder. She looked at the top page for a moment and then looked up. "I've reviewed the preliminary package your attorney submitted this morning. I've looked at the Meridian Horizon documentation, and I've spoken with Gregor Van's attorney." She paused. "Before we go further, I need to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." "Yes," Naomi said. "At any point in your marriage or in your professional capacity within Volkov Holdings, did you knowingly participate in, facilitate, or have advanced knowledge of criminal financial operations conducted through Damian Volkov's organization?" She met Hartley's gaze. "No." "Did you ever receive direct financial benefit from those operations?" "No. My compensation from Volkov Holdings was structured as a board salary, which is documented. My independent holdings are entirely clean. My attorney has the records." "We have the records," Hartley said. "Your attorney was thorough." She looked at the folder again. "The Meridian Horizon signature. You've never seen this document before?" "No." "You have no knowledge of how your signature came to appear on it?" "I have a detailed theory," Naomi said, "based on what Gregor Van told me, and on the timeline of Sokolov's operational planning relative to his known activities." She paused. "And I have the documentary record of my own financial activity on the dates the LLC was formed, and the documents were signed, which establishes that my participation would have been logistically impossible without my knowledge, because the financial signature of someone genuinely involved would have been visible in my own records, and it is not." Hartley looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite what Naomi had expected. It was something more like, she worked to identify it, the expression of someone who had prepared for a complicated conversation and found it was going to be less complicated than anticipated. "Ms. Carter," Hartley said, "the material your attorney submitted this morning, combined with what Van has provided and what we've been developing independently on the Sokolov organization for the past 14 months, she stopped, put her hand flat on the folder. "It's a significant package. I know what it is. What I want to understand is what you want from this." Naomi looked at her. "I want the forged document to be formally identified as fraudulent. I want my name removed from any investigative framework as a party of interest and established as a party of cooperation. And I want to go forward." She paused. "I want to go forward and not have this follow me." Hartley looked at the folder, then back at her. "The fraudulent document. We can establish that. The signature analysis alone will take some time, but the circumstantial record you've provided is strong enough to establish the forgery framework immediately." She paused. "The investigative framework? Yes. Your cooperation changes your designation significantly." "And Sokolov?" "Sokolov is a matter that extends well beyond today's meeting," Hartley said. "The material you've provided is going to be part of something that's already in motion. That process has its own timeline." "But it's in motion." "It has been in motion," Hartley said. "What you've provided accelerates and substantiates it considerably." Naomi sat with that for a moment. She thought about 2 years. Sokolov watching Damian's operations for 2 years, identifying the load-bearing element, building the instrument of her destruction carefully, and without her knowledge, the patience of it, the specific cold intelligence of it. She had thought 4 weeks ago that she was the most strategic mind in the situation she was leaving. She had been wrong. She had been one of the most strategic minds. There had been others. She had learned from that. She would not make the same category of error again. "There's one more thing," she said. Hartley waited. "Damian's divorce filing. He's planning to file within 48 hours, citing economic sabotage. The filing will contain language designed to establish a public narrative around my resignations from Volkov Holdings positions that misrepresents the nature of those resignations." She paused. "I'd like my cooperation here, and the federal context of this meeting, to be something that his attorneys are made aware of before that filing happens, through whatever channel is appropriate." Hartley looked at her with the calibrated expression that didn't give much away. Then she said, "I imagine that's something your attorney can communicate." "I imagine so too," Naomi said. She left the federal building at 12:47 and stood on Dearborn in the noon light and called Dara. "It went well," she said. She heard Dara breathe, a single, controlled exhalation that contained the equivalent of what other people might have expressed more dramatically. "How well?" "Well enough. I need you to communicate the federal context of this morning's meeting to Felix Doran before 3 p.m. Not the substance, just the existence, and the designation change." "I'll do it in the next hour," Dara said. "Naomi, Damien's filing. If his attorneys hear about this before they file, they might reconsider the language," Naomi said, "or they might file anyway. Either way, the record exists." "Either way," Dara agreed. She drove back across the city. At 1:43, her phone showed a message from Felix Doran, advising my client to reconsider the filing language. Need time. She read it and put the phone down. At 2:15, Marcus called. "I resigned," he said. "In writing, effective immediately. I cited personal reasons and provided 2 weeks' salary waiver to move it quickly." A pause. "Damien is..." He seemed to consider how to describe it. "He's not well." "Describe it." "He's been on the phone since this morning. Not his usual contacts. People I don't recognize. He's trying to reach Sokolov directly, and the calls aren't being returned." Another pause. Felix came in at noon and spent an hour with him behind closed doors. When Felix left, he looked like a man who just told someone their house was on fire. She processed this. "Is there anyone left in his operational structure who's managing the day-to-day?" "His direct assistant and 2 junior people. Everyone else is waiting to see which way this goes." Marcus paused. "Raymond Cass called the main office this morning and asked to speak with you specifically. When they told him you weren't available, he didn't leave a message." She thought about Raymond Cass, who had called her twice in the weeks after the gala, who had told her he considered her a separate party from Damien, who had been in the room at Cask's house when Damien announced his engagement, and whose response had been a smile that didn't mean what smiles were supposed to mean. "If Raymond calls again," she said, "tell him I'll be in touch." "All right. Marcus," she paused, "thank you for all of it." "Yeah," he said, with the specific terseness of a man who was done with the situation they'd both been in and was looking at what came next. "When does Carter Financial Group open its doors?" She almost smiled. 60 days, she said. "If you're interested in a conversation." "I'll check my calendar," he said. She could hear the thing underneath it. Not lightness exactly, but the sound of someone looking at a horizon they hadn't been sure they'd see. At 3:35, her phone rang. The number was Damien's, but the voice that spoke when she answered was not Damien's. It was Lena. She had not expected that. She adjusted. "I'm calling because he can't," Lena said. Her voice did not have the warm construction it had carried in the voicemail from 3 weeks ago. It was stripped down to something harder and less managed. There are people here and he can't talk, and I thought..." She stopped. "I thought maybe you would talk to me." "You thought I would help him," Naomi said. A pause. "I thought you might help the situation." "Lena," she kept her voice even, "what is happening there right now?" A beat, then, "2 men came to the house this afternoon. They said they were from Sokolov's office. They spoke with Damien for..." Her voice went briefly unsteady and then recovered. 45 minutes. Damien told me to go upstairs. I went upstairs. I could hear them." Another pause, shorter. "They were not asking for things. They were telling him things." She understood what that meant. Sokolov had been waiting for 48 hours too, waiting to see whether Naomi would take the settlement, waiting to see whether the leverage of the forged document would hold. When it hadn't held, when the package had reached Hartley and the designation had shifted and Felix had walked into that office looking like a man whose house was on fire, Sokolov had recalibrated. And his recalibration looked like 2 men at Damien's door telling him what the new arrangement was. "Is Damien physically all right?" she said. "Yes." Lena's voice was small in a way it had not been capable of being at the gala, in the red dress, with the calibrated provocation. "They left 20 minutes ago. He's been sitting in the study since then. He won't talk to me. She thought about telling Lena that this was the harvest of what she'd helped plant. She thought about the specific and deliberate cruelty of that question. Doesn't she deserve that at least? Delivered to a room of 500 people. She thought about it, and then she did not say any of it, because it wasn't useful, and it wasn't the point, and she was not a woman who needed the satisfaction of the speech. She had other satisfactions now. You should leave the house, Lena, she said. Take what's yours and go somewhere else tonight. Don't use credit cards. Call someone you trust. She paused. And don't call me again. She hung up. She sat in the car outside Catherine's building in the West Loop with the afternoon light coming through the windshield and the city doing what it always did. And she felt the weight of the day pressing through her. Not heaviness, not collapse, but the specific gravity of a day in which a great many things had moved and the direction of their movement had not finally been wrong. She got out of the car and went upstairs. Catherine was at her desk and looked up when Naomi walked in and read her face with the speed of someone who was good at reading things. You're all right, Catherine said. I'm all right. What happened? Naomi sat down across from her and put both hands flat on the table. She felt the solidity of it under her palms, the specific physical reassurance of something real and stable. The federal contact went well, she said. Dara is managing the filing issue. Sokolov's people visited Damien this afternoon, which tells me the pressure is redistributing. She paused. Marcus resigned from Volkov Holdings. Catherine was quiet for a moment. It's moving. It's moving, Naomi said. Is there anything left for us to manage tonight? She thought about it. She went through the sequence. Hartley had the package. Van's cooperation was signed. Marcus's documentation was incorporated. The filing issue was being managed. Sokolov's move on Damien was its own information, telling her that the vacuum in Volkov Holdings had become something Sokolov felt he needed to fill by force rather than attrition, which meant he was moving faster than his preferred pace, which meant he was reactive rather than strategic. Reactive people made mistakes. Tonight, she said, we work on the partnership structure, the entity formation documents, the things that need to be ready when we open the doors. She looked at Catherine. Because the next 72 hours are going to produce a significant amount of noise. And when the noise clears, I want us to already be standing. Catherine opened her laptop. Then let's stand, she said. They worked through the afternoon into the evening. At 6:14, Dara sent a message. Felix communicated. Filing delayed pending review of language. Damien's attorneys requesting meeting with me tomorrow. At 7:50, Marcus sent a message. 3 of Damien's remaining operational contacts requested a call with me. I told them I was no longer with the organization and referred them to you personally. 2 of them said they'd wait. At 9:03, Gregor Van sent a single text to the number he'd used to contact her, which she'd kept active for exactly this. Thank you. She put the phone down and kept working. The entity formation documents were nearly complete. The registered agent was selected. The banking relationship was established. A clean, private bank with no history of Volkov Holdings involvement, a relationship she had begun quietly 2 months ago through a financial contact who had no idea of the broader context. The office space Catherine was leasing could absorb a small team for the first year. The 3 client commitments, Brandt, Reyes, Park, gave them a credible opening book. At 10:47, Catherine set down her coffee and stretched and looked across the table at Naomi with an expression that was tired and alert and something else. Something that was perhaps the equivalent, in a person as practically minded as Catherine, of what other people might call wonder. Can I ask you something? Catherine said. Yes. The night of the gala, when you walked out. She paused. Did you know? Any of it? Did you know what was going to happen? Naomi considered the question honestly. I knew what I intended to do, she said. I didn't know what was already in motion around me. She paused. I underestimated how many people had been watching. And now? She looked at the entity formation documents on the table between them, at the name on the top page, Carter Financial Group, at the date she'd written beside it, which was 60 days from today, at the structure beneath it, the thing she'd been building and had nearly lost and had fought for and had not lost. Now, she said, I know that the most dangerous thing I can do is stop paying attention. She looked up at Catherine. which I'm not planning to do. Catherine nodded, and there was something in the nod that was not just acknowledgement, but recognition. The recognition of a person who understood, from their own years in a world where attention was survival, exactly what that meant and exactly how much it cost. At 11:22, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Damien. Not his attorney, not Lena, not Marcus relaying information. His number, which meant his hand on the phone, which meant something had shifted in the study where he'd been sitting since Sokolov's men left, sitting with whatever calculation he'd been running and wherever it had landed. She looked at the phone. The ringing continued. Catherine was watching her across the table without expression. The phone rang a fourth time, a fifth. Naomi picked it up and held it in her hand and looked at his name on the screen, and she thought about 11 years, about the gala, about the cold October street, about the legal pad with its circled name, about the federal building on Dearborn and the drive she'd carried across the city in the dark, and the moment she'd handed it to Dara in the street under the sodium light. She thought about everything that was now in motion and everything she had set in motion and everything that had been set in motion around her without her knowledge. And she thought about the fact that every thread of this, every single thread, led back to the moment he'd raised his hand in a ballroom full of people and believed that what he was striking was a woman who would absorb it. He had been wrong about that. She answered the call. Naomi, he said. His voice was like nothing she'd heard from him before. Not the performative warmth, not the cold authority, not the stripped calculation of the past weeks. It was smaller than all of those. It was the voice of a man sitting alone in a study in a house that had very recently been visited by people who reminded him of what the world looked like when it stopped deferring to him. He stopped. I need to talk to you. She said nothing. She waited. Everything is... Another stop. Longer. They're taking the Western operations. Sokolov's people. They came here and they told me the terms and I don't... His voice tightened and then released, the sound of a man who had learned a long time ago not to show weakness and who is failing at that now, not dramatically, but in the specific and quiet way of a person who has run out of other options. I don't have anyone to call. I called Felix and he told me he can't. He said the legal situation is... A breath. I need you to tell me what to do. She looked at Catherine across the table. Catherine was very still. She thought about what it had cost her to be the person he called when he didn't know what to do. 11 years of that. 11 years of being the answer to that question, invisibly, without credit, without acknowledgement, until the moment he'd stood in a room of 500 people and announced she'd never meant anything to him. She thought about how much it would cost her to be that person again. She thought about the entity formation documents on the table. Damien, she said, her voice was even. Not hard. She didn't need it to be hard. It was simply even, the same as it had been in the hallway of the Lincoln Park house when she'd told him she was done, the same as it had been in the federal building, the same as it had been on every phone call and in every meeting of the past 5 weeks. Because evenness was not coldness, it was simply what happened when you had run out of things to perform and arrived at what you actually were. You need an attorney, she said, one who handles the kind of situation you're in right now. Not Felix, someone with a different specialty. Call Raymond Kask and ask him for the name. Raymond knows people. She paused. That's all I can tell you. Naomi, that's all, she said. She ended the call. She put the phone face down on the table. The room was quiet. Outside, the West Loop at 11:30 p.m. was doing its late version of itself, the industrial quiet of a neighborhood that worked in daylight and rested in dark. A car passed on the street below. Somewhere in the building, something mechanical cycled on and then off. Catherine said, "Are you all right?" She sat with the question for a moment. She took inventory, body first, the way she'd learned to do in the weeks since the gala, starting from the physical and working outward. Hands flat on the table, steady, shoulders level, breathing even and complete. Her cheek, where his hand had connected 5 weeks ago, was healed now, the last of the tenderness gone, and she only knew where it had been because she remembered. "Yes," she said. She pulled the entity formation documents toward her and uncapped a pen. "Where were we?" she said. Catherine looked at her for a moment. A long, specific moment. The look of a person taking the measure of someone they've chosen to stand beside. And then she opened her laptop. "The registered agent section," Catherine said. "We were deciding on the state of registration." "Illinois," Naomi said. She wrote the word in the appropriate field. "We're Chicago. We stay Chicago." She wrote it down and moved to the next section and kept going, and the pen moved across the paper in the quiet of the West Loop office, and the city pressed its light against the windows. And in the document taking shape under her hands, line by line, in the space where her own name sat at the top of the page. Not Volkov, not the name of a man who'd built nothing without her. Carter, her name, the name she'd been born with and reclaimed and would now carry forward into everything that came next. The final shape of what she'd been building was becoming visible. Not finished, not yet, but visible. Real. And entirely hers. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in February, 4 months after the gala, in a courtroom on the 14th floor of the Daly Center, with gray winter light coming through the windows, and a judge who had read the settlement agreement with the particular economy of motion of someone who had signed many of these and found this one unremarkable. It was unremarkable. Naomi had not fought for the house, or the furniture, or the wine cellar, or the 6-bedroom life she had decorated and maintained and made functional for 11 years. She had fought for the clean documentation of her independent assets, for the legal separation of her financial identity from Damien's, and for the record, formal, public, attached to the case number, that established her cooperation with federal authorities and her designation as a non-party in the investigation of Volkov Holdings and its associated entities. She had gotten all 3. The rest she had left without looking back, because objects were objects, and she had never needed the objects. She walked out of the Daly Center alone, down the steps and onto Washington Street in the February cold, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her coat closed and her hands in her pockets and let the cold move through her and out the other side. People moved around her on the sidewalk. Nobody knew her. The city was doing what it always did. She thought about the woman who had stood outside the Chicago Meridian Grand 5 months ago in an October that was just beginning to go cold, her cheeks still warm, her champagne glass left on a server's tray, walking into the night with a decision that felt finished but was only, she understood now, a beginning. She thought about how certain she had been in that moment, how alone in that certainty. She was still certain. But the certainty was different now. Not the clean, abstract certainty of someone who has decided something in private, but the harder and more specific certainty of someone who has been tested against the decision and found it to be real. She walked to where she'd parked and drove to the West Loop. Carter Financial Group had been open for 6 weeks. The office occupied the top floor of a building on Randolph. Not lavish, not yet, but real in the way that mattered. People in it, working, the sound of phones and keyboards and 2 voices from the conference room where Catherine was on a call with a client in New York. Marcus Webb sat at a desk near the window that looked out over the city he'd worked in for 20 years, and he had the particular focused expression of a man doing work he understood the purpose of, which was different from the expression he'd worn in the last years of Volkov Holdings, and she could see the difference clearly. She had hired 3 people beyond Catherine and Marcus, a junior analyst, a compliance officer, and an administrative coordinator who had previously worked at one of the institutional clients and who understood the specific demands of the environment. It was a small team. It was the right size. She went to her own desk and sat down and opened her laptop and worked through the afternoon without interruption. At 4:15, Marcus appeared in her doorway. He didn't knock because they had established early that knocking was unnecessary. "You saw the news this morning," he said. "Yes," she said. She had seen it before she'd gone to the courthouse. The coverage of the federal indictment handed down the previous afternoon against Viktor Sokolov and 2 of his senior associates, the first public movement of the investigation, whose architecture she had helped supply, moving at the pace investigations moved when they were built on solid ground rather than assembled in haste. The indictment did not mention her name. The indictment did not mention Damien's name. Not yet. That was coming, her attorney had told her, in a separate filing at a separate pace. And when it came, it would include a reference to a non-participating cooperating party whose documentation had been material to the case, and that reference would be her, and it would not require her to do anything further except exist cleanly in the life she was building. And Volkov Holdings, Marcus said. She had seen that too. The formal announcement of receivership, filed the previous week, the legitimate businesses passing into administrative control pending asset evaluation. 3 of those businesses, the cleanest ones, the ones she had built from operational frameworks she had designed, had been identified by the receiver as viable standalone entities with management structures worth preserving. She had not contacted the receiver. She did not need to. Those entities would survive or they wouldn't, and either way they were no longer her problem. I saw it, she said. He nodded. He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed and looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of checking in, not intrusive, not sentimental, just present. How are you? She thought about it honestly. Tired, she said, and fine. He accepted that at face value, which was why she'd been able to answer honestly. I got a call from Raymond Kask this morning, he said. He wants to know if you'd be willing to take a meeting. She thought about Raymond, who had attended the announcement dinner, who had smiled the wrong kind of smile, who had called her twice after the gala and told her he considered her a separate party, she had learned in the weeks since, declined to participate in the Western Territory arrangement when Sokolov's terms became clear, and who had retained an attorney and provided his own cooperation to federal investigators through a separate channel. She did not know what Raymond wanted from a meeting. She suspected it was not entirely different from what Brandt and Reyes and Park had offered: proximity to competence, relationship with someone who had demonstrated that they understood the difference between building something and consuming it. Tell him I'll have my assistant reach out to schedule something, she said. 6 weeks from now, minimum. We have enough on the calendar. Marcus nodded once and pushed off the doorframe and went back to his desk. She worked until 7. She shut the laptop and put on her coat and turned off her office light and walked through the space. Dark now, the team gone, only the ambient light of the city coming through the windows. And she stopped in the middle of it for a moment and looked at it. The desks, the conference table, the small kitchen they'd outfitted with a good coffee machine because good coffee was a reasonable expenditure and people worked better with it. The wall beside the entrance where Catherine had hung a single piece of art, something abstract, dark blue and gold, that she'd chosen because she liked it, not because it communicated anything to anyone. It was a real place. It existed. It was doing what she'd imagined it doing when she'd written the name on the legal pad in the River North apartment at midnight, with the city pressing its light against the windows. Not perfectly. Not without friction. The first 6 weeks had contained 3 significant problems, 2 difficult conversations, and 1 near loss of a client relationship that she and Catherine had spent 4 hours managing back from the edge. None of that was surprising. Nothing that was worth building was built without that. She walked out and took the elevator down and stepped onto Randolph Street and stood in the February dark. She thought about Lena Marsh, who had called her that night in Damien's voice using Damien's phone, and who had left the Lincoln Park house within a week of Sokolov's men leaving it, and who had, by all accounts Naomi had stopped actively seeking, relocated to another city and another life with the practical efficiency of someone whose attachment had always been to a condition rather than a person. She did not think about Lena with contempt. She thought about her, when she thought about her at all, with the specific and limited attention she extended to people who had made their choices and were no longer in her proximity, the acknowledgement of an existence without the weight of a verdict. She thought about Damien. She had not spoken to him since the phone call from the study, his voice small and stripped in a way she had never heard it. She had heard about him since then through attorneys and through the fragments of news that were unavoidable in the ecosystem of Chicago business. The receivership, the federal proceedings developing on a separate timeline from Sokolov's, the Lincoln Park house listed with a broker in January. She did not know where he was living. She had not tried to find out. He was someone she had known very well for a long time and would not know again. And the shape of that was not grief. She had moved through whatever grief there was for the marriage in the months before the gala, in the slow erosion of years, and what remained when she examined the space where Damien had been was not loss, but something closer to the recognition of weight she had been carrying that she was no longer carrying. She felt it in the absence. She felt lighter in a way that was structural rather than emotional, the lightness of a building that has had its load properly redistributed. She thought about him in the way she thought about things that had been true and were no longer true, with accuracy, without revision, without the need to rewrite the 11 years into something cleaner or uglier than they had been. They had been what they had been. She had been who she had been in them. And she had become, through the specific pressure of everything that had happened, someone who was not that person any longer. Not a better person, necessarily, in any abstract moral accounting, but a more accurate one. A person whose external life matched her internal one in ways it had not when she'd been managing the gap between the two for 11 years. She stood on Randolph Street in the February cold for another moment. A cab went past. Two people walked by talking about something she couldn't hear. The city moved around her, indifferent and enormous and entirely ordinary. She started walking toward the parking structure. She did not walk fast. The pace of the past 5 months had been relentless in its way. The specific relentlessness of a sustained emergency that had required every resource she had at her highest capacity for longer than emergencies were supposed to last. And she felt the residue of that in her body, a tiredness that was not defeat but depletion, the kind that sleep addresses but does not fully resolve, that resolves only over time, over months of ordinary days that accumulate their small restoration. She was in those months now. She could feel it, the beginnings of them. She thought about what came next, and what came next was not dramatic. It was the client meeting tomorrow morning and the compliance review next week, and the conversation with Catherine about the second office. Not yet, Catherine had said. 6 months, give it 6 months, and she was right. It was Marcus's recommendation for a fourth analyst, and the decision about whether to formalize the advisory board before the end of the quarter. It was the work, in other words. It was the ordinary and demanding and genuinely satisfying work of building something that was real. She reached her car and got in and started it, and sat for a moment with the heat beginning to move through the interior and the dark of the parking structure around her. She thought about the pearl necklace she still wore sometimes, her mother's, the one she'd worn to the gala. She thought about the watch she'd left behind in the Lincoln Park house because she'd decided, somewhere in the process of taking only what was necessary, that she didn't need to keep a watch given to her by a man who had measured her value and utility and found it insufficient. She thought about the coat she'd ordered to the River North apartment, the coat that had cost her the address, and how she still wore it because it was a good coat and it was warm and the coat was not the problem. She pulled out of the parking structure and turned onto Randolph and drove through the city. The streets were wet with the remnants of afternoon snow that had not accumulated, just darkened the pavement and the sidewalks, and then stopped. The lights of the city moved across the windshield in the way they did at night, fractured and bright, the city showing itself in pieces through the glass. She drove without music. She did not need music right now. The quiet was enough. The quiet was, in fact, exactly what she needed. Not the forced quiet of a woman controlling her response to something she didn't want to feel, but the genuine quiet of someone who had come through a significant amount of weather and had arrived, not at the absence of weather, but at a place inside herself where the weather no longer defined the landscape. She drove home, not the Lincoln Park house. An apartment in the South Loop that she had chosen because it had good light, and a kitchen she liked, and was entirely, completely, not a concession to anything except her own preferences. She had painted one wall in the living room, a color she had wanted to paint something for years, a deep, specific green, the color of old glass. And she had done it herself one Sunday in January, badly at the edges and not caring, and it was still there, imperfect and entirely chosen. She parked and went upstairs and stood in the apartment with her coat still on for a moment, looking at the green wall in the dark, lit only by the city light coming through the windows. Then she took off her coat and hung it up and went to the kitchen and made tea and stood at the window with the mug in her hands, looking out at the city that had always been hers in the only way a city can belong to someone, through the accumulation of years of walking its streets with your eyes open, of learning its patterns, of building things in it and losing things in it and staying anyway. The tea was hot. She drank it slowly. She let the heat of it move through her, all the way down, and she stood in the dark of her own apartment in the city she had chosen to stay in, and she breathed. In, out, the simplest thing, the most fundamental one, the thing that had kept its rhythm through all of it, and was keeping it now. And she looked at the lights of Chicago pressing against her window, and she felt, without drama and without announcement, The specific quiet of a woman who has survived exactly what she survived and arrived, at the end of it, in a life that belongs to her. She finished her tea. She set the mug in the sink. She went to bed.